snapped and scored. A forbidden love, football romance about second chances and taking the ultimate risk. By Win Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Chapter 1: Sparks Ignite. The late afternoon sun beat down on the practice field, casting the heat of 1,000 suns onto the turf where Blaze sprawled out, the sweat glistening on his skin. Today felt like one of those days, where everything was somehow both a challenge and an exhilaration. With every heartbeat, he could feel the rhythm of the game pulsing through his veins. Blaze exploded off the line, his cleats gripping the ground like a vice. He'd run this route 1,000 times before, practically memorizing every inch of the field, but today was different. The humidity hung thick in the air, wrapping around him like a second skin. The faint twinge in his recently healed shoulder ignited a fire of determination within him. Pushing through it, he cut hard to the left, the trajectory of the ball spiraling down toward him. Time slowed to a crawl as he stretched out, his muscles burning, fingertips reaching just enough to make the catch. The familiar thump of the football hitting his hands sent a jolt of satisfaction through him, even as his shoulder protested against the sudden movement, sending a small shockwave of pain that he fought to ignore. That's what I'm talking about. Ethan Cole, their quarterback, jogged over with a wide grin plastered across his face. Ethan's calm, level-headed demeanor often steadied the team. Still got that blazing speed, man. Blaze gave a small nod, a mixture of pride and hesitation roaring in the pit of his stomach. But the praise felt hollow against the pressure mounting within him. His focus was less about accolades and more about proving to himself, more than anyone else, that he was back to full strength. The injury from that warehouse fire 3 months ago loomed over his mind like a specter, whispering doubts into every play he executed. Coach Caldwell's penetrating gaze across the field only intensified that urge to perform. He pushed aside his insecurities, focusing instead on the present task. The sun overhead blared down, but the cool breeze that occasionally swept across the field felt invigorating, filling him with energy. That was until a flash caught his attention. The glimmer distracted him slightly. Turning his head, he spotted Tessa Caldwell, Coach Caldwell's daughter, moving like a graceful dancer along the edge of the field. Tessa raised her camera, capturing every moment. Today she wore a simple tank top and jeans that clung perfectly to her form. The late afternoon light glinted off her lens, lending an almost magical quality to the scene as she moved with purpose, dropping to one knee to get the shot. Strands of her dark hair cascaded down, framing her face in a way that made his heart race uncomfortably. Rivera. Eyes on the field. Coach Caldwell's voice boomed, yanking Blaze back to reality. Blaze snapped his attention back to the play, forcing himself to focus on the defensive coverage rather than the sight of Tessa, who had once again drawn him in. With a deep breath, he burst forward again, running a deeper route. His legs pushed harder, faster, as if racing against the storm brewing inside of him. The football sailed high, he had to leap for it, extending fully as he soared through the air. This time the ball slipped past his fingertips like sand through an hourglass. "Damn it," he muttered, jogging back to the line, frustration creeping in quickly as he processed another missed opportunity. From the sidelines, Lila Carson's voice sliced through the tension in the air. "Getting some good action shots there, Tess." "Just doing my job," Tessa replied, but Blaze could hear the flush of embarrassment in her voice, burning hotter than the sun beating down on them. He firmly kept his gaze forward, refusing to let the distractions take hold. "Aha," Lila countered, her teasing tone light. "And I'm sure the fact that certain players look particularly good in motion has nothing to do with your artistic choices. Would you keep it down?" Tessa hissed, but Blaze could sense the underlying nervousness that flavored her words. It made his cheeks heat up, and he forced his focus straight ahead, pretending not to hear the banter while internally he grappled with his awareness of Tessa's presence. Gritting his teeth, Blaze ran the next 3 plays flawlessly, channeling his pent-up energy into every explosive sprint. Each time he caught the ball, he could feel Tessa's camera tracking his every move. But he didn't dare look her way. He couldn't afford the distraction, especially with Coach Caldwell's hawk-like scrutiny weighing down upon him. "Rivera, take a knee," Coach called out after the last play, pulling him from that whirlwind of focus. Blaze jogged over, his heart racing for reasons beyond the exertion of practice. Up close, Coach Caldwell wore the mask of a seasoned veteran, but Blaze could sense the clock ticking for him, as if waiting for a performance that would define their futures. "Your timing's off," Coach said, leaning in close so the others couldn't overhear. The stern tone carried the weight of authority, the kind reserved for critical moments. "You're hesitating before your cuts, favoring that shoulder. I need to know if you're ready for this season, son. No weak links." Blaze clenched his jaw, fighting back the urge to defend himself. "I'm good, Coach. The shoulder's fine." "Is it?" Coach shot back, his eyes narrowing like a predator ready to strike. "What I'm seeing out there isn't the same receiver who broke our touchdown record last season. We've got scouts coming to the first game. This could be your shot at the next level, but not if you're playing at 70%. The words landed harder than any tackle he'd ever faced. They gnawed at him, making him acutely aware of his limitations. Tessa lingered nearby, pretending to adjust her camera settings while clearly listening in. A burning wave of frustration mixed with embarrassment flooded through him, a cocktail of emotions that churned violently in his chest. "I'll do better," he said simply, the grit in his voice surprising even himself. Meeting Coach's gaze, he held steady, igniting a flicker of determination deep within. Coach Caldwell studied him for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Then he nodded, albeit reluctantly. "See that you do. Now hit the showers, we're done for today." As the team began to disperse, Blaze caught Tessa lowering her camera. Their eyes met briefly, and something twisted painfully in his chest at the concern etched on her face. It was a fleeting connection, one that felt deeper than mere acknowledgement, yet he didn't need anyone's sympathy, especially not from Coach's daughter. Suddenly, he found his feet leading him toward the locker room without conscious thought. His shoulder throbbed more than he was willing to admit, a reminder that he wasn't yet whole. Behind him he could hear Tessa's soft voice laced with concern. "Dad, don't you think you were a little hard on him?" "Sometimes being hard on them is the only way to keep them safe," Coach replied, voice gruff yet tinged with an undercurrent of worry. Blaze picked up his pace, not wanting to hear more. He had enough to prove, without adding Tessa's concerned looks to the mix. But as he pushed through the locker room door, he couldn't shake the memory of her watching intently through her camera lens, or the way his skin had hummed with awareness every time her gaze lingered on him. He stripped off his practice jersey, wincing as his shoulder protested the movement. Coach was right, he wasn't at 100% yet. But he'd rather push through the pain than admit weakness, especially now, with scouts eyeing his every move in their upcoming game. Those scouts might be his last shot at going pro, and he couldn't let anything stand in his way. Not an old injury, not Coach Caldwell's doubts, and definitely not the way his pulse jumped every time he caught Tessa's eye from across the field. As he finished changing, his phone buzzed with a familiar alert tone. He checked the message and felt a flicker of adrenaline surge through his body. A small electrical fire at one of the beachfront restaurants, nothing major, but it needed immediate attention. "Duty calls?" Ethan asked, laughter dancing in his eyes as he noticed Blaze's quick movements. Yeah, shouldn't be anything serious. Blaze shouldered his bag, trying to shake off thoughts of his performance on the field. He headed for the exit, but the murmurs of his teammates landed on his ears. Man, Coach's daughter was really working that camera today. Did you see how she kept circling back to get more shots of? Blaze pushed through the door before he could hear the rest, heat rising in his cheeks despite his best efforts to remain calm. He'd learned long ago to tune out locker room talk, especially when it revolved around Tessa. The guys meant well, but they didn't understand the delicate dynamics at play. As he jogged toward his truck, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that intertwined along the pavement. He spotted Tessa and Lila sitting on the bleachers, heads bent over the camera's display screen, with Tessa's laughter ringing out like music. The sight stirred something deep within him, a melody that felt all too familiar. Wow, Tessa, these are amazing! Lila exclaimed, her fingers pointing to the screen. The composition on this one? I don't know, Tessa replied, uncertainty filtering through her voice. The lighting's all wrong, and I missed the peak moment on that diving catch. Blaze couldn't help but glance back, drawn in by the sincerity of Tessa's critique. The deep furrow of her brow as she studied her work made something twist painfully in his chest. He could see how passionately she cared, how much of herself she poured into her photography. The sight made him want to reach out, to tell her that capturing moments like these wasn't just about lighting or angles, it was about resonance, about feeling. But he forced himself to look away, picking up his pace before the moment could plunge any deeper. Arriving at the restaurant, he found the firefighters had already contained the small blaze, an overheated electrical panel that had started smoking, but thanks to well-placed prevention measures, it had been resolved before any significant damage occurred. Good timing, Rivera, his captain said as they packed up the equipment. Thought you'd still be at practice. Just finished. Blaze's voice felt steady, a sign of the control he cultivated even when his thoughts spiraled miles away. He helped coil up the hoses, careful to avoid straining his shoulder. Coach had us working on timing patterns today. How's that shoulder holding up? The captain asked, his brow furrowed, always the voice of concern. Fine, Blaze answered reflexively. Getting stronger every day. It was what he wanted to believe, and he sensed his captain's skepticism, but there was no judgment there. The team worked efficiently, packing gear and checking their logs, their camaraderie a soothing balm on the rough edges of Blaze's anxiety. There was a balance here, a brotherhood forged in shared experiences, all their troubles crammed into the trucks parked outside waiting for that next call. Back at the firehouse, Blaze resumed his routine of checking equipment and updating logs, deliberately moving through the motions, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. Yet images kept invading his concentration. Tessa's careful movements as she framed the shots, the intensity sparkling in her eyes when she reviewed the captures, the way she had looked at him with something more than just concern after Coach's critique, a faint glimmer of understanding that rattled him unexpectedly. Earth to Blaze, Martinez called from across the room, breaking Blaze free from his spiral of thoughts. You planning on finishing that inventory report sometime today? Blaze blinked, realizing he'd been staring blankly at his paperwork, confirmed by the light-hearted laughter echoing around the room. Yeah, sorry. Just tired from practice. Aha. Martinez grinned, that teasing light in his possessive gaze. Nothing to do with a certain photographer who was at said practice. Don't start, Blaze muttered, but despite the warning, he couldn't hide the subtle smile tugging at the corner of his lips. There was a warmth to the camaraderie here, one that reminded him of who he was outside of football. Hey, all I'm saying is there are worse things than catching the eye of Coach's daughter, Martinez quipped, his benign humor energizing the room, making it feel lighter. Even if it means dealing with Big C's legendary death glare. Through the firehouse windows, Blaze caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Tessa was walking to her car, camera bag slung over her shoulder like an expert. She paused and turned, glancing toward their building, and their eyes locked through the glass, an electric moment that jolted him. In that instant, the world outside, the cool evening breeze, the sounds of laughter among teammates, faded into a background hum. There was something in her gaze, something warm and inviting, that made him yearn for a deeper connection. But just as quickly as it began, The spell broke when someone called his name from inside, snapping him back to reality. By the time he turned to look, Tessa was already sliding into her car, the moment lost forever, leaving him with just a fleeting memory of that undeniable spark between them. "Rivera. Need you on this equipment check," his superior barked, punctuating the evening's tension. "Coming," he called back, forcing himself to turn away from the window and concentrate on the work at hand. It was easier to focus on the physical tasks, the repetitive movements that grounded him, keeping the chaos of his thoughts at bay. Still, as he moved through the remainder of his shift, checking equipment and executing drills, thoughts of Tessa persisted, wrapping around his consciousness. They seeped into the margins of his mind like ink on a page, threading themselves into the fabric of his thoughts, unsettling him more than expected. How she captured him mid-flight. To her, he was more than just a player. He was a subject of beauty and elegance, something he had never really considered before. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of routine and minor calls. By the time he clocked out, the sun had long since set, painting the horizon in shades of orange, lavender, and deep indigo. Gone was the golden light that had made everything feel significant. Instead, the cool darkness wrapped around him, a private cocoon of reflection. With the stars beginning to twinkle overhead, it was easier to remember his priorities, heal his shoulder, prove himself to coach, stay focused on his goals. Everything else, especially the way his heart had jumped when Tessa caught his eye, would have to wait. As he stepped out of the firehouse and into the night, the salty air of the ocean breezes whipped against his skin, filling his lungs and settling a semblance of peace within him. Though he knew he had a long road ahead, Blaze felt that familiar spark ignite deep inside, the relentless drive to push forward, reclaim his place on the field, and maybe, just maybe, figure out this complicated dance with Tessa Caldwell along the way. Chapter 2: Flirting with Trouble. Tessa fiddled with her camera settings as families filtered into Oceanview Park for the annual Summer Splash fundraiser. The community event was her first real gig since moving back home, and her stomach fluttered with equal parts excitement and nerves. Getting the contract had been a small victory, even if her father's connection to the Sharks had probably helped, but it was a start. "You've got this," she muttered, adjusting her lens as kids darted past in swim gear, headed for the water activities. The park had been transformed into a carnival-like atmosphere with dunk tanks, slip-and slides, and various game stations where Sharks players would be volunteering throughout the day. A burst of laughter drew her attention to one of the game stations, and her breath caught. Jason Rivera, Blaze, was helping a young boy hold a football properly, his hands gentle as he adjusted the kid's grip. She raised her camera instinctively, capturing the moment as Blaze crouched down to the boy's level, his smile genuine and warm. Through her viewfinder, she noticed details she hadn't before. The way his practice-worn Sharks t-shirt stretched across his shoulders, how the morning sun caught the hints of gold in his dark hair, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he laughed. She snapped another photo as he high-fived the boy after a successful throw. "Well, well, well." Lila's voice made Tessa jump. "I see you found your muse." "I'm working," Tessa protested, lowering her camera. The organizers wanted candid shots of the players interacting with kids. "It's good PR." "Aha." Lila crossed her arms, grinning. "And the fact that you've taken about 50 shots of a certain firefighting wide receiver is purely professional?" "I haven't taken 50. Tessa glanced at her shot counter and felt her cheeks warm. Okay, maybe she had gotten a little carried away. "Your face is redder than a lobster at the crab shack," Lila teased. "Just admit you think he's hot." "Everyone does. It's like a scientific fact." "Keep your voice down," Tessa hissed, but it was too late. As if sensing their conversation, Blaze looked up, catching her eye across the field. Instead of looking away, he held her gaze and slowly raised one eyebrow, his lips curving into a knowing smirk. Tessa's finger pressed the shutter button before she could stop herself. That shot was definitely not making it into the official event portfolio. "Oh my God," Lila cackled. "You're so busted." "I need to get shots of the other stations," Tessa mumbled, turning to escape, but Blaze was already walking toward them, that infuriating smirk still in place. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Enjoying the view?" Tessa certainly is, Lila chirped, earning an elbow to the ribs. I'm just doing my job, Tessa said, lifting her chin. The organizers wanted natural shots of the players, volunteering. You happen to be in frame. About 50 times, Lila added helpfully. Blaze's smirk widened. 50, huh? Must be my good side. You're impossible, Tessa said, but she couldn't help smiling. Besides, you're the one who keeps looking at the camera. Maybe the camera's not what I'm looking at. His voice dropped slightly, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. Lila made a choking sound. And that's my cue to check out the dunk tank. I heard tanks up next, and I wouldn't miss that for the world. She shot Tessa a not-so-subtle wink, before practically skipping away. Alone with Blaze, Tessa became acutely aware of how close he was standing. He smelled like sunscreen and something uniquely him, and she had to resist the urge to lift her camera again, to capture the way the sun was playing across his features. So, he said, nodding at her camera, you going to show me these allegedly amazing shots? They're not ready yet. Besides, a photographer never reveals their unedited work. Is that an actual rule, or did you just make that up? It's definitely a rule. Very official. They teach it in Photography 101. He laughed, a sound rich and genuine. Somehow I doubt that. He stepped closer, peering at her display screen. Come on, just one preview? Nope. She clutched the camera to her chest, trying to ignore how his proximity made her pulse quicken. You'll have to wait for the finished product like everyone else. Even if I ask nicely? His eyes sparkled with mischief. Especially if you ask nicely. I'm immune to charm, Rivera. Challenge accepted, he said, and the way he was looking at her made her wonder if they were still talking about photography. A shout from the football station broke the moment. Hey Blaze. We need backup over here. Duty calls, he said, but he didn't move immediately. You know, if you wanted more action shots, I'm about to teach these kids the perfect spiral. Could make for some good photos. Is that your subtle way of asking me to take more pictures of you? Nothing subtle about it. He winked and started walking backward toward the station. But I promise to give you my good side. All 50 times. Tessa laughed despite herself, watching him jog back to the growing group of kids. She lifted her camera again, this time not bothering to hide her smile as she framed the shot. Maybe Lila was right about finding her muse, but that was one admission she definitely wasn't ready to make out loud. Tessa lowered her camera, watching Blaze demonstrate another perfect spiral to an enthusiastic group of kids, when screams erupted from the direction of the slip-and slide. Her head snapped toward the commotion, where a small crowd was gathering. Without hesitation, Blaze sprinted past her, his playful demeanor instantly replaced by focused intensity. Tessa followed, camera ready, as he pushed through the crowd to reach a young girl clutching her arm, tears streaming down her face. Hey there, sweetheart, Blaze said, his voice gentle as he knelt beside her. I'm Blaze. Can you tell me what happened? The girl sniffled, looking up at him with wide eyes, her bottom lip trembling. I slipped on the concrete. My arm really hurts. A small trickle of blood ran down her elbow from a scrape. Tessa raised her camera, capturing the moment as Blaze carefully examined the girl's arm. Through her lens, she saw the subtle shift in his expression, the slight furrow of his brow, the determined set of his jaw, the way his shoulders squared with purpose. This wasn't the charming football player from earlier who'd been tossing perfect spirals. This was Jason Rivera, firefighter and first responder, completely in his element. What's your name? He asked, maintaining eye contact with the girl as he gently palpated her wrist, his touch careful and practiced. The tenderness in his movements made Tessa's heart flutter. Sophie, the girl whispered between hiccups. Well, Sophie, I think you might have sprained your wrist. Nothing too serious, but we should get some ice on it right away to keep the swelling down. He glanced up at the worried mother hovering nearby, her hands clasped tightly against her chest. There's a first aid station by the registration tent. I'll walk you over, okay? We'll get you fixed up in no time. Sophie nodded, and Blaze scooped her up effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing at all. Tessa's finger pressed the shutter again, capturing the contrast between his strong arms and the gentle way he cradled the injured girl. The crowd parted like waves as he carried Sophie toward the first aid station, her small hand gripping his shirt, her tears already beginning to dry. "That's quite a shot you got there." The gruff voice carried a hint of something Tessa couldn't quite place. Tessa lowered her camera to find her father standing beside her, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his Sharks baseball cap. She hadn't even noticed him approach, too caught up in watching Blaze through her viewfinder. "Rivera's good with the kids," she said carefully, keeping her voice neutral, knowing her father's tendency to read too much into things. The last thing she needed was him picking up on the way her pulse quickened whenever Blaze was around. "He's a good player," Big C replied, emphasis on player. "But he needs to stay focused on football. The team can't afford any distractions this season." The warning in his tone was clear. Tessa bristled but bit back her response, choosing instead to review the photos she'd just taken. The organizers wanted authentic community involvement. "I'd say helping an injured child qualifies. Just remember who you're representing with these photos, Tessa. The Sharks need positive publicity, not what, Dad?" She turned to face him fully. "Not real moments, showing your players as actual human beings? Because from where I'm standing, that's exactly what builds community support." Before he could respond, her phone buzzed. The event coordinator had texted, asking to see some preliminary shots. Grateful for the excuse to escape, Tessa headed for the registration tent, where she found the coordinator, Sarah, reviewing photos on her laptop. "These are incredible," Sarah gushed as Tessa transferred the new images. "Especially these ones of Rivera with the kids. That rescue moment? Pure gold. This is exactly what we needed, real connection, not just pose shots." Pride bloomed in Tessa's chest. "Thanks. I tried to capture genuine interactions rather than staged moments." "Well, it worked. The sponsors are going to love these. Would you be interested in covering more events for us?" "Absolutely," Tessa said, perhaps too quickly, but Sarah just smiled. "Great. I'll have my office send over some dates." "And Tessa?" Sarah lowered her voice conspiratorially. "That shot of Rivera smirking at the camera? Maybe not for the official portfolio, but definitely frame that one for yourself." Heat crept up Tessa's neck as she remembered that particular photo. It's not. Honey, I've been running these events for 10 years. I know chemistry when I see it." Sarah winked and turned back to her laptop, leaving Tessa flustered. "There you are." Lila appeared, linking her arm through Tessa's. "I saw your knight in shining Under Armour carrying that little girl. Very heroic. Please tell me you got pictures." "Of course I did. I'm a professional." "Aha. And I'm sure your rapid-fire shooting had nothing to do with those biceps in action." Lila steered them toward the refreshment tent. "So, when are you going to admit you're totally into him?" "I'm not," Tessa stopped herself, sighing. "It doesn't matter anyway. You heard Dad earlier at practice. The team needs to stay focused." "Oh, please. Dad's just being Dad. You're allowed to have a life outside of the Sharks bubble, you know. And speaking of life, Sarah just told me she wants you for more events." "That's huge." "Yeah, it is." Tessa smiled, letting herself feel proud of the achievement. Her fingers absently traced the strap of her camera. "Maybe I can actually make this photography thing work." "Of course you can. You're talented as hell, and unlike some people," Lila shot a pointed look toward their father in the distance, who was animatedly discussing plays with Drew, "I actually follow your Instagram. Your work is amazing. That sunset series you did last week? Pure gold." Movement caught Tessa's eye, and she turned to see Blaze emerging from the first aid tent, his dark hair still damp from the earlier rescue. He caught her gaze and gave her a small nod, his expression softening slightly before Tank called him over to the dunk tank. Her heart did that annoying little skip it always did when he looked at her that way. "Earth to Tessa," Lila sang, waving a hand in front of her face. "You know, for someone who's not into him, you sure spend a lot of time staring. I counted at least 30 seconds that time." "I'm observant." It's part of being a photographer. Tessa adjusted her lens cap, trying to look busy. Right. And I'm sure your camera just happened to focus on his. Don't you have a surf shop to run? Actually, yes. But this is way more entertaining. Lila grinned, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Seriously though, you deserve to be happy. And if tall, dark, and heroic makes you happy. It's complicated, Tessa muttered, watching as Blaze helped Tank adjust the dunk tank seat, his muscles flexing beneath his wet shirt. She forced herself to look away. Only because you're both making it complicated. But fine, I'll drop it. For now. Lila squeezed her arm. I really do need to get back to the shop. Walk you to your car? Tessa nodded, gathering her equipment. As they headed toward the parking lot, she couldn't help taking one last photo, Blaze launching himself into the dunk tank to the delight of the crowd, his laughter carrying across the field. She knew it would end up in her private collection, along with too many others she couldn't bring herself to delete. Later, as she loaded her gear into her car, she felt eyes on her. Looking up, she found Blaze watching her from across the lot, that same intense expression from their earlier interaction. He raised his hand in a slight wave, and she returned the gesture, ignoring the flutter in her stomach and the voice in her head that whispered maybe, just maybe, Lila was right. Complicated, she reminded herself, sliding into the driver's seat. But as she drove away, she couldn't help thinking about the way he'd smiled at her, the gentleness in his hands as he'd helped Sophie, the electricity she'd felt when he'd stood close. Maybe complicated wasn't always a bad thing. Chapter 3, Forbidden Attraction. Blaze pulled his truck into the small lot behind Seaside Sips, his muscles aching from the morning's particularly brutal practice. Coach had been riding him hard lately, and while he understood the pressure to perform, the constant scrutiny was starting to wear thin. He needed caffeine, and lots of it, before heading to his afternoon shift at the firehouse. The familiar chime of the cafe's door barely registered as he stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and sea air mixing in that uniquely coastal way. He was scrolling through his phone, checking the station's schedule, and grimacing at the extra overnight shift he'd picked up for next week, when a flash of movement caught his eye. Tessa Caldwell sat in one of the window booths, her camera bag beside her, as she gestured animatedly to Lila Carson, sunlight streaming through the glass behind her like a spotlight. His feet stopped moving before his brain could catch up, muscles still aching from practice forgotten. There was something about the way the morning light caught Tessa's hair, turning the dark strands to warm honey at the edges, the passionate energy in her movements as she talked. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment he allowed himself to really look at her, drinking in the sight like a man dying of thirst. You gonna order something, or just stand there blocking traffic? Maggie's amused voice cut through his thoughts, tinged with that knowing tone she seemed to reserve just for him lately. Blaze cleared his throat, feeling the heat rise to his neck as he shifted his weight to his good leg. The usual, please. Extra shot. His voice came out rougher than intended. Rough practice? Maggie asked, already moving to make his drink, her hands flying over the espresso machine with practiced ease. You could say that. He pulled out his wallet, trying not to look too obvious as he caught bits of the conversation from the booth, though his training as a first responder made it second nature to stay aware of his surroundings. Dad just doesn't get it, Tessa was saying, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear, frustration evident in every word. It's like anything that isn't football might as well not exist. Because Big C's world revolves around that field, Lila replied, stirring her drink with more force than necessary. But that doesn't mean yours has to. Blaze shifted his weight again, feeling like he was eavesdropping but unable to tune them out completely. He knew that feeling all too well, the weight of expectations, the pressure to be what others needed you to be. The constant battle between duty and desire that seemed to define his every waking moment lately. Here you go, hun. Maggie handed him his coffee, the extra shot already making the brew smell stronger than usual. Maybe take it over there. She nodded toward Tessa and Lila's booth, with a knowing smile that made him wonder just how transparent he was being. Before he could decide whether to make a quick exit or take Maggie's suggestion, Lila spotted him. Well, if it isn't Oceanview's finest, she called out loud enough to make several heads turn. Both on and off the field. Her grin was positively wicked. Tessa's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing slightly as she met his gaze. Something flickered in her expression. Embarrassment? Interest? Before she composed herself, though her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her camera bag in a way that made his heart skip. Ladies, he said, nodding in their direction. The smart thing would be to leave now, avoid any complications. But his feet were already moving toward their booth. Join us, Lila said, standing up. I was just leaving anyway. Got a shop to run and all that. She winked at Tessa, who shot her a look that could have melted steel. Subtly, Tessa muttered, but she shifted over to make room. Blaze slid into the booth, telling himself this was just coffee, just being friendly with his coach's daughter. Nothing more. Heard you got some great shots at the community event, he said, taking a sip of his coffee. They turned out okay. Tessa fiddled with her camera strap. Though I'm pretty sure half of them were just you showing off for the kids. Showing off? He raised an eyebrow, feeling more at ease than he probably should. I was demonstrating proper safety techniques. Is that what you call that touchdown dance? Her eyes sparkled with amusement. Hey, the kids requested it. He grinned, remembering the group of young boys who'd begged him to recreate his signature move. Can't disappoint the fans. Tessa's smile faded slightly as she looked down at her coffee. At least someone appreciates what you do. Both jobs, I mean. The shift in her tone was subtle, but he caught it. Your photography's amazing, Tessa. Anyone who's seen your work knows that. Try telling that to my dad. She let out a small laugh, but it held no humor. Sometimes I think if I'm not holding a football or dating a player, I might as well be invisible. Blaze felt something tighten in his chest. He knew exactly what it was like to feel trapped by others' expectations. You know, when I first decided to be a firefighter alongside playing ball, everyone thought I was crazy. Said I was risking my career, spreading myself too thin. What made you do it anyway? Tessa looked up at him, really looked at him, and for a moment he forgot they were in a public place. Because it was what I needed to do. Not what anyone else needed me to do. He leaned forward slightly. Your dad's a great coach, but he's not the one behind that camera. You are. The moment stretched between them, charged with something that made his pulse quicken. Tessa opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the cafe's door chimed. Coach Charlie Caldwell's imposing figure filled the doorway, his eyes immediately finding them in their booth. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Rivera, Big C said, his voice carrying that same edge it had during practice. Didn't expect to see you here. Don't you have a shift starting soon? Blaze checked his watch, though he knew exactly what time it was. Yes, sir. Just grabbing coffee on my way. Dad, Tessa said, and Blaze could hear the strain in her voice. We were just chatting about the community event photos, Blaze cut in smoothly, standing up. Tessa got some great shots of the team interacting with the kids. Good PR for the Sharks. Big C's expression remained neutral, but his eyes told a different story, the kind of cold, assessing look Blaze had seen him give players right before benching them. I'm sure she did. Rivera, walk with me. Need to discuss some plays before your shift. Blaze nodded, knowing this wasn't really about plays. His stomach twisted with the same tension he felt before running into a burning building. He glanced at Tessa, wishing he could say more, explain more, tell her that this wasn't how he'd wanted things to go. But she was already gathering her things, her movements quick and precise, like she couldn't get away fast enough. Thanks for the company, she said, not quite meeting his eyes, her voice carrying that slight tremor he'd noticed whenever she was trying to keep her emotions in check. I should get going anyway. Got some editing to do. As Blaze followed Coach out of the cafe, he could feel Maggie's sympathetic look following them. The weight of it pressed against his shoulders, adding to the burden he already carried. He'd known getting close to Tessa was complicated, knew the risks involved, to his position on the team, to her relationship with her father, to everything he'd worked so hard to build. But sitting there, watching her talk about her passion for photography, seeing the fire in her eyes when she described capturing that perfect moment, he was starting to think some risks might be worth taking, even if it meant facing Big C's wrath. Big C's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife through fog. "Rivera, let's talk about your focus this season." Blaze barely registered Coach's lecture about maintaining focus and professional boundaries. His mind kept drifting back to the way Tessa's eyes had lit up when she talked about her photography, the slight curve of her lips when she teased him about his touchdown dance. He nodded at appropriate intervals, muttering "yes sir" and "understood coach," while watching Tessa hurry down the sidewalk through his peripheral vision, her camera bag bouncing against her hip. "Are we clear, Rivera?" Big C's stern voice snapped him back to attention, those steel-gray eyes boring into him with the intensity of a searchlight. "Crystal clear, coach." Blaze straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to meet his coach's gaze even as his stomach twisted with guilt. "I should head to my shift." He grabbed his duffel bag, the familiar weight doing little to ground him today. The drive to the firehouse was a blur of ocean views and replaying their conversation at Seaside Sips. He couldn't shake the memory of her vulnerability when she'd mentioned her father, the way she'd let her guard down for just a moment. The slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers had nervously traced the rim of her coffee cup, it had felt real, different from the casual flirtations he usually encountered at post-game celebrations or charity events. Later that afternoon during team practice, Blaze missed an easy catch, something that hadn't happened since his rookie days. The ball sailed right through his hands, landing with a dull thud on the turf, the sound echoing his embarrassment across the field. "Head in the game, Rivera." Coach bellowed from the sidelines, his face reddening beneath his signature navy cap. Tank jogged up beside him, clapping him on the shoulder with enough force to make Blaze wince. "Man, where are you today? Because it sure ain't here on the field." The linebacker's knowing smirk only made things worse. "Just tired," Blaze muttered, getting back into position, his cleats digging into the artificial turf. But as he lined up for the next play, his eyes drifted to the spot where Tessa usually stood with her camera, that vintage Nikon always ready to capture the perfect moment. "Empty today, of course." "Tired, my ass," Cole chuckled as they huddled up, his quarterback's voice pitched low enough that only their immediate circle could hear. More like distracted by a certain photographer. "You know Coach's daughter?" "Shut it, Cole." Blaze's voice held an edge that made his teammate raise his eyebrows, those usually steady hands clenching involuntarily at his sides. "Hey, no judgment here." Tank grinned, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun. "But maybe save the googly eyes for after practice?" Blaze ignored them, focusing on the next play. Or trying to. He executed it perfectly this time, muscle memory taking over where his scattered concentration failed. His body knew what to do even when his mind wandered: plant, pivot, accelerate, catch. But even as he caught the ball and drove it down the field, cleats churning up rubber pellets, he couldn't help wondering if Tessa would have captured the moment, if she would have noticed the way he'd adjusted his route to compensate for the wind. After practice, he hit the showers quickly, avoiding the usual locker room banter and good-natured ribbing. He needed to clear his head before his next shift at the station. This thing with Tessa, whatever it was, had to stop before it started. He had a good thing going with the Sharks, a respected position at the firehouse, a life he'd carefully built piece by piece. Getting involved with Coach's daughter could jeopardize everything he'd worked for, could bring down the house of cards he'd spent years stacking just right. But even as he told himself this, he couldn't forget the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, genuine and warm behind her camera lens. His phone buzzed as he was leaving the locker room. A text from Lila. "Just saw Tessa's shots from the community event. You should see how she captured you with those kids. Looking pretty heroic there, Blaze." He stared at the message longer than necessary before shoving his phone back in his pocket without responding. Lila was as subtle as a freight train, and he didn't need the encouragement. What he needed was distance. Focus. Professional boundaries. The kind that kept careers intact and father-daughter relationships undamaged. The afternoon sun beat down as he crossed the parking lot, and he could smell salt on the breeze coming off the ocean. Usually that scent centered him, reminded him of why he loved this town, why he'd chosen to build his life here between the firehouse and the football field. Today, it just reminded him of Tessa sitting in that sunlit booth at Seaside Sips, talking about her dreams, the way her hands had moved animatedly as she described the photography series she wanted to create about local heroes. Rivera. Coach's voice carried across the lot. A word? Blaze turned, squaring his shoulders, fighting the instinct to check if Tessa was anywhere nearby. Here it came, another lecture about focus and priorities. But Big C's expression was different this time, less stern and more concerned. The look reminded him uncomfortably of the one his captain at the firehouse wore during particularly risky calls. "Look, son," Coach began, his voice lower than usual. "You're one of our best players. And a damn good firefighter from what I hear. That takes dedication. The kind most men can't maintain." "Yes, sir." The words felt thick in his throat. The kind of dedication that doesn't leave room for distractions. Coach's meaning was clear, hanging between them like smoke. Especially not now, with the season we're facing. The team needs you focused, Rivera. 100%. Blaze met his coach's eyes steadily, calling on years of maintaining composure in crisis situations. "I understand, Coach. Won't be a problem." The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. Big C studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good man. See you tomorrow." Walking to his truck, Blaze made a decision. He'd keep his distance from Tessa Caldwell. No more coffee shop run-ins, no more lingering looks during practice, no more letting himself imagine what could be. It was better this way, safer for his career, for the team's dynamic, for everyone involved. Even if something in his chest tightened at the thought, a feeling remarkably similar to smoke inhalation during a bad fire. He'd learned to push through that too. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Lila. "Photography contest deadline next week. Tessa's on the fence about entering. Maybe she needs a little encouragement from someone who believes in her work." Blaze read the message twice before deleting it. No. He wasn't going to be that encouragement, no matter how much he wanted to be. Tessa deserved someone who could support her dreams openly, not someone who had to pretend not to notice her from across a football field. He started his truck, the engine rumbling to life with a familiar growl that usually brought him comfort. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he caught a glimpse of something in his rearview mirror, Tessa's silver Honda pulling in, probably to meet her father for their weekly lunch. His hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, and he forced himself to keep driving, to not look back, to not wonder if she'd seen him leaving. Focus on the field. Focus at the station. That's what mattered. That's what had to matter. The team needed him at 100%, and the department couldn't afford any distractions, especially not with the summer fire season approaching. His phone lit up one final time as he stopped at a red light. An email notification popped up. The department's PR team wanted to use some of Tessa's photos from the community event for their social media. Of course they did. They were probably perfect, capturing both the strength and humanity of the firefighters, just like everything else about her that he was trying not to think about. Her eye for detail, the way she could find beauty in the most unexpected moments, how she'd made even his most awkward pose look natural. Damn it, he was thinking about her again. The light turned green, and Blaze pressed the accelerator maybe a little harder than necessary. He had a shift to get to, lives to potentially save. He couldn't afford to be distracted by thoughts of Tessa Caldwell and her camera, no matter how much those thoughts wanted to linger. Chapter 4: The Fire Blaze. Tessa's phone buzzed with the local emergency alert, and her heart skipped when she saw the address. Ocean Grove, just 2 blocks from her apartment. Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed her camera bag and car keys. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as she pulled up to the scene. Smoke billowed from a 2-story Craftsman, angry orange flames licking at the windows. Her hands trembled as she attached her zoom lens, but years of practice steadied her movements. The acrid smell of burning wood made her eyes water, but she blinked it away, focusing on the job at hand. Through her viewfinder she spotted Blaze emerging from the smoke, his turnout gear covered in soot. He carried an elderly woman in his arms, her small frame clutching a terrified cat to her chest. Tessa's finger pressed the shutter, capturing the determination etched across his face, the way his jaw clenched with each purposeful stride. Her breath caught at the raw power and grace in his movements, so different from his fluid athleticism on the football field. "Ma'am, you need to stay behind the line," a firefighter called out to her, waving her back from where she'd unconsciously drifted closer. Tessa held up her press pass. "I'm with the Oceanview Tribune." The lie slipped out easily. She'd been meaning to pitch them anyway. The firefighter nodded and turned his attention back to the scene, leaving her to wrestle with a familiar pang of guilt. Through her lens, she tracked Blaze as he handed off the woman to waiting paramedics. He paused only long enough to catch his breath before heading back toward the house, and her stomach clenched with worry. The next few minutes were a blur of clicking shutters and held breath as she documented the controlled chaos, trying to ignore how each passing second heightened her anxiety. Then it happened. Blaze emerged again, this time with another firefighter supporting an unconscious man between them. As they cleared the doorway, a section of the porch roof groaned and gave way. Blaze shoved his partner and the victim clear, but couldn't quite clear the falling debris himself. A chunk of burning wood caught his shoulder, and Tessa's gasp matched the crowd's collective intake of breath. Her camera nearly slipped from her sweaty palms. He stumbled but didn't fall, helping get the victim to safety before finally allowing himself to sit on the curb. Tessa lowered her camera, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wanted to run to him, to check if he was okay, to feel for herself that he was still whole and breathing. But she forced herself to keep shooting, even as her hands shook with suppressed emotion. These moments mattered. They told the real story of who he was beyond the football field and carefully maintained image. And maybe, she admitted to herself, they also captured exactly why she couldn't stop falling for him, despite knowing better. "You absolute idiot." Lila's voice cut through the crowd as she pushed her way forward, her dark hair flying wildly around her face. Tessa hadn't even noticed her arrival, too caught up in her own churning emotions. "What were you thinking?" Blaze looked up at Lila, managing a weak smile despite the pain evident in his eyes. The soot streaking his face made the whites of his eyes stand out starkly. "Had to get them out." "And get yourself killed in the process?" Lila's hands were on her hips, but Tessa could see the fear beneath her friend's anger, recognized it in the slight tremor of Lila's fingers. "The team needs you in one piece, you know." "I'm fine," Blaze insisted, though he winced when the paramedic began examining his shoulder, the charred edges of his uniform revealing angry red skin beneath. "Just a bruise." Tessa couldn't stay back any longer. Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. She approached slowly, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck, the weight of it a reminder of how she'd documented his reckless bravery. "That was incredible," she said softly, crouching beside him, fighting the urge to brush the ash from his face. "Terrifying to watch, but incredible." His eyes met hers, and something flickered in their depths, vulnerability maybe, or recognition of the concern in her voice. The intensity of his gaze made her pulse skip. "Just doing my job." "It's a second-degree burn," the paramedic announced, gentle but firm. "You'll need treatment, Rivera." Later, Blaze started to argue, but Tessa surprised herself by laying a gentle hand on his uninjured arm, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "Let them help you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please?" He stared at her for a long moment, and Tessa felt the weight of everything unspoken between them, all the stolen glances and careful distance they'd maintained. Finally, he nodded. "Fine," he conceded, his voice rougher than usual, like he'd swallowed smoke. "But only because I don't want to hear Lila lecture me all the way to the hospital." "Oh, you're getting the lecture anyway," Lila assured him, but her relief was obvious in the way her shoulders relaxed. As the paramedics helped Blaze onto a stretcher, he caught Tessa's gaze again, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Those better be good photos," he said, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. "Make me look heroic at least?" Tessa's laugh was shaky, but genuine. "Trust me, you didn't need any help with that." She hesitated, then added quietly, "You scared me." Something softened in his expression. "I'm okay, Tessa. Really." "I know," she whispered, though her heart was still racing. "Just be more careful? The team needs you." She swallowed hard. And not just the team. The moment stretched between them, heavy with meaning, until Lila cleared her throat. "All right, Romeo, time to get that shoulder looked at. Tessa, you coming with us?" Tessa nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As they followed the ambulance to the hospital, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Blaze had looked at her. Like maybe she wasn't the only one fighting feelings that could complicate everything. That single glance had held more meaning than all their careful small talk over the past few months combined. The photos on her camera would tell the story of a hero saving lives, but they couldn't capture the way her hands still trembled, or how her heart had nearly stopped when that roof came down. They couldn't show how badly she wanted to reach for him, to make sure he was real and whole and safe. Her fingers itched to touch him, to trace the line of his jaw where soot had smudged his skin, to feel his pulse steady and strong beneath her touch. But she kept her hands firmly on her lap, knowing that crossing that line would change everything, for both of them, for the team, for her father. Still, the urge lingered, as persistent as the scent of smoke that clung to her clothes. Some stories, Tessa was learning, couldn't be captured through a lens at all. Tessa paced the hospital corridor, her camera hanging heavy around her neck like an anchor. The emergency room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, making everything feel slightly unreal, as if she were viewing the world through a distorted lens. Lila had stepped out to grab coffee, leaving Tessa alone with her churning thoughts and the steady beep of distant monitors. When a nurse finally waved her toward Blaze's room, her heart stuttered against her ribs. He sat on the edge of the bed, shirtless except for the white bandage covering his right shoulder, his turnout gear discarded in a sooty heap in the corner. The sight of him, alive, mostly whole, made her breath catch in her throat. Even now, covered in ash and looking exhausted, he was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. "Hey, photographer," he said softly, his voice rough from smoke. "Come to document my battle wounds?" She managed a weak smile, stepping closer despite herself. The scent of smoke clung to him, mixed with antiseptic and something uniquely him. "How bad is it?" "Second-degree burn, like they thought. Nothing career-ending." His attempt at humor fell flat as his voice wavered slightly, betraying the fear she knew he was trying to hide. "Doc says I'll be back on the field in a week or two." Tessa moved to stand beside him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the tiny muscle that twitched there betraying his stress. "And how are you really?" He looked down at his hands, strong hands that caught footballs and saved lives, and something in his carefully maintained composure cracked. "That roof. I heard it before I saw it. That cracking sound." He swallowed hard, and she watched his throat work with the effort. "For a second there, I thought," he broke off, shaking his head, leaving the dark possibilities unspoken between them. Without thinking, Tessa reached for his hand. His fingers were rough, warm against hers. "You scared me too," she admitted. "When I saw you go down." "I'm usually better at compartmentalizing," he said quietly, his thumb absently stroking the back of her hand. "The job, the team, everything else. But seeing you there, watching." He squeezed her hand and the pressure sent warmth spreading through her chest. It hit different. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Tessa could hear the distant crash of waves, feel the evening breeze carrying salt and worry. Her free hand moved to her camera, seeking familiar comfort. "I got some amazing shots," she said, then winced at her own insensitivity. "God, that sounds terrible. You were risking your life and I was just—" "Hey." His voice was gentle, stopping her spiral of guilt. "That's your job. Telling stories that matter." He gestured to her camera, his firefighter's calluses brushing against her arm. "Show me." She pulled up the photos on her display screen, trying to ignore how aware she was of his proximity as she clicked through them. The scent of smoke still clung to him, mixed with something uniquely Blaze. His sharp intake of breath, at the shot of him carrying the elderly woman, made her pause. The image captured him emerging from the smoke, determination etched on his soot-streaked face. "You made me look like some kind of hero," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. You are one, she said simply, fighting the urge to trace the strong line of his jaw. These aren't staged or filtered. This is just you doing what you do. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the images, his shoulder pressing warm against hers. Submit them, he said finally, his eyes never leaving the screen. To wherever you were planning to. They're incredible, Tessa. But. No buts. Your talent deserves recognition. His faith in her made something flutter in her stomach. The praise warmed her cheeks, but guilt still nagged at her conscience like a persistent itch. Dad's going to flip when he sees your injury. Blaze's expression hardened slightly. I can handle, coach. 2 days later, Tessa watched from the sidelines as Blaze ran drills, her camera hanging unused around her neck. His movements were slightly stiffer than usual, each wince he tried to hide making her heart clench. Her father's narrowed eyes tracked every play, every slight hesitation, like a hawk watching its prey. Rivera. Big C's voice boomed across the field, making several players jump. You're favoring that shoulder. Something you want to tell me? Just a minor strain, coach, Blaze called back, but Tessa could see the pain he was hiding. He pushed harder on the next play, making a diving catch that had her heart in her throat. Damn fool's going to make it worse, her father muttered, not realizing she was within earshot. And where exactly did he strain that shoulder? Been watching him for weeks now, something's not right. Tessa busied herself with her camera, pretending she hadn't heard, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the lens. But she noticed how the other players were exchanging worried glances, how Drew pulled Blaze aside during water breaks with concern etched on his face. The summer heat beat down mercilessly, making everything feel more intense, more dangerous. After practice, she found Blaze in the empty weight room, pressing an ice pack to his shoulder. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion in his features that he tried so hard to hide on the field. You're pushing too hard, she said softly, her heart aching at the sight of him. He didn't look up, his jaw clenched tight. Can't afford not to. Blaze. I can't let them down. The team, the department. He finally met her eyes, and the raw pain there stole her breath. You. The honest vulnerability in his voice drew her closer, like a magnet she couldn't resist. You don't have to prove anything to me. You never did. Don't I? His free hand came up to cup her cheek, callous fingers gentle against her skin, and Tessa's heart raced at the contact. Your father's already suspicious. If he finds out about the fire, about us, everything I've worked for could fall apart. There's an us? The words slipped out before she could stop them, hanging in the air between them like sparks ready to ignite. Instead of answering, he leaned forward and kissed her. His lips were soft, careful, like he was afraid she might break or run. Tessa melted into him, her hands finding his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. The scent of him, pine and smoke and something uniquely Blaze, surrounded her. The kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate, full of all the words they hadn't said. His fingers tangled in her hair, and she pressed closer, mindful of his injury but needing him closer, needing to eliminate any space between them. The weight room faded away, until there was nothing but this moment, this feeling. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, reality crashed back in like a cold wave. What they'd just done, what they'd started, could complicate everything. Could destroy everything. I should go, Tessa whispered, though she made no move to step away, her fingers still curled in his shirt. Dad will be looking for me. Blaze nodded, but his hand lingered on her waist. Tessa, I know, she cut him off, not ready to hear whatever he might say. Her heart couldn't take any more emotional whiplash right now. Me too. She forced herself to step back, to turn away, but she could feel his eyes on her as she left, like a physical touch trailing across her skin. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, and her heart felt too big for her chest, full of equal parts joy and terror at what they'd just done. The weight of their shared secret pressed against her ribcage with each breath. The photos from the fire had already been submitted to both the local paper and a prestigious photography contest. They would tell one story, of heroism, of sacrifice, of duty. But they couldn't capture this, The way her hands shook as she touched her lips, remembering his kiss, the fear of what her father would say if he knew, the certainty that despite everything she wanted more. The images showed Blaze as the town hero, but they missed how gentle his touch had been, how his eyes had softened when they met hers, how perfectly they'd fit together in that stolen moment. She'd captured his bravery through her lens that night, but this was the story she'd have to keep locked away in her heart. Some lines once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. Tessa wasn't sure she wanted to try. Chapter 5: Keeping Secrets. Blaze checked his phone for the third time in 5 minutes, his heart racing as he read Tessa's text again. "Meet me at sunset. Our spot." Their spot. The secluded stretch of beach behind the old lighthouse had become their refuge over the past week. Away from prying eyes and whispered rumors, they could just be themselves. Not Coach's daughter and the team's star receiver, just Tessa and Jason. The thought of seeing her made his heart race faster than any touchdown sprint. He winced as he pulled his practice jersey over his head, the motion sending a sharp twinge through his injured shoulder. The burn from the rescue last week had mostly healed, but the muscle strain underneath was getting worse, not better. Every catch, every tackle reminded him that he wasn't invincible. Still, he'd rather deal with the pain than admit weakness or risk losing his starting position. The team needed him too much for that. "You heading out?" Tank asked from his locker, eyeing Blaze with concern. His longtime teammate had always been perceptive, maybe too perceptive. "You were favoring that shoulder pretty bad during drills." "Just tired," Blaze said, forcing a casual shrug that made him want to curse. His shoulder screamed in protest. "Nothing an ice pack won't fix." Tank didn't look convinced, his broad frame blocking Blaze's path slightly. "Maybe you should." "I said I'm fine." The words came out sharper than intended, and Blaze immediately regretted it. Tank was just looking out for him like always. "Sorry, man. Long day at the station." The memory of smoke and flames from his last shift still lingered in his nose. "Yeah, well, just don't push it too far. We need you at 100% for the finale." The finale. 2 weeks away, and the biggest game of their season. The Sharks needed this win, not just for pride but for survival. Sponsorship deals and community support hinged on their performance. Every time Blaze closed his eyes, he saw the crucial passes he'd need to catch, the plays that could make or break their future. No pressure. Blaze grabbed his bag and headed for the door, his mind already drifting to the sunset meeting with Tessa, but Coach Caldwell's voice stopped him cold. "Rivera." A word. Big C stood in his office doorway, arms crossed over his chest. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression even more unreadable than usual. The man who'd been like a second father to him now seemed more intimidating than any defensive line. "Sir." "Close the door." Blaze's stomach twisted as he stepped into the small office. Photos of past teams lined the walls, along with newspaper clippings celebrating the Sharks' victories. Among them he spotted several featuring Tessa's photography, her talent for capturing raw emotion evident even in newsprint. One showed Blaze mid-leap, stretching for a game-winning catch, and his shoulder twinged at the memory. "Your head's not in the game," Big C said, cutting straight to the point. "Last 3 practices you've been distracted. Slower on your routes. Making rookie mistakes." "I've been dealing with some extra shifts at the station." The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Don't bullshit me, son." Coach's voice was quiet but firm. "I've watched you juggle both jobs for 2 years without missing a step. This is different." Heat crept up Blaze's neck. His phone seemed to burn in his pocket, Tessa's text message weighing on him like a guilty secret. "Coach, whatever's going on, handle it. This team needs you focused. We can't afford any distractions." The way he emphasized that last word made Blaze's pulse quicken. Did he know? The thought of Big C discovering his relationship with Tessa sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with his injury. "Yes, sir. Won't be a problem." Big C studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Ice that shoulder. I want you running clean routes tomorrow." Blaze escaped into the cooling evening air, his mind racing faster than his feet ever could on the field. He'd been careful, they both had, watching every glance, measuring each interaction in public. But Coach wasn't blind, and Tessa was his only daughter, his pride and joy. The thought of disappointing him, of betraying the trust of a man who'd given him a chance when so many others wouldn't, sat like lead in Blaze's stomach and made his injured shoulder throb with renewed intensity. Still, his feet carried him to their beach, where Tessa waited on their usual driftwood log, weathered smooth by salt and time. The setting sun painted her skin gold, catching in her dark hair and making it shimmer like polished copper. Her camera rested in her lap as she watched the waves roll in, the same waves they'd spent countless evenings admiring together. She looked up at his approach, her smile making his chest ache with a sweetness that rivaled his shoulder pain. "Hey stranger," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the whisper of the surf. "Hey yourself." He sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth but not touching. Not yet. The wood was still sun-warmed beneath him, comfortable and familiar. "How was your day?" "Actually, amazing." Her eyes lit up with excitement, the same way they did when she caught the perfect shot. "Remember those photos I submitted to the Pacific Coast Photography Contest? They accepted my entry. The showcase is in 2 weeks and—" She stopped, her smile faltering as she read his expression. "What's wrong?" "The finale," he said, understanding dawning in her eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "It's the same weekend, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, her shoulders dropping slightly. "Saturday night. I was hoping you might come to the showcase. But the game." "Tess." The nickname slipped out before he could stop it, soft and familiar on his tongue, and she leaned into him slightly, her jasmine perfume mixing with the salty air. "I know. The team needs you. It's fine, really. Dad will be at the game anyway, so maybe it's better this way." The mention of her father made Blaze tense, his muscles coiling like before a big play. "About that. I think he suspects something." "What? How?" Her voice pitched higher with worry. "Just little things. Comments about distractions. The way he watches us during practice, like he's trying to piece together a puzzle he doesn't want to solve." "Is that why you were pushing so hard today?" She pulled out her camera with practiced ease, showing him a shot from that afternoon's practice. In it he was mid-route, face tight with concentration or pain, his body a blur of motion against the autumn sky. She'd captured the exact moment his shoulder had seized up, his form just slightly off in a way only someone who knew him well would notice. "You're hurting yourself, Jason." The use of his real name, so rare from her lips, made him look away toward the darkening horizon. "I can handle it." "Like you handled that 3-alarm fire last week?" Her voice was gentle but firm, like the tide reaching for the shore. "I saw the way you winced when Tank clapped your back earlier. I got that on camera too. You can't hide from my lens." "Been watching me pretty closely, huh?" He tried for teasing, but it came out strained, like his voice after a long practice. "Someone has to." She set her camera aside with careful movements and turned to face him fully, her knee brushing against his thigh. "I'm worried about you. And not just because of the injury." "Tess." "No, listen. I know what this team means to you. What my dad's opinion means to you. But you can't keep pushing yourself like this. Something's got to give, and I'm afraid it's going to be you." The waves crashed against the shore, filling the heavy silence between them with their steady rhythm. Finally Blaze reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers, feeling the familiar calluses from her camera work against his palm. "I don't want to let anyone down," he admitted quietly, the words carrying more weight than any football he'd ever caught. "Including me. Especially you." She squeezed his hand, her grip strong and sure. "Then be honest with me. Are we worth the risk?" The question hung between them as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep purples and oranges, nature's own highlight reel. Blaze thought about the team, about Big C's trust, about everything he stood to lose. Then he looked at Tessa, really looked at her, and knew his answer had been decided the moment she first caught him in her lens, capturing something in him he hadn't even known was there. "Yes," he said simply and kissed her. Later, as they walked back to their cars, Blaze's phone buzzed with a text from Lila. "Need to talk. It's about Tessa." He glanced at Tessa, who was still smiling from their stolen moment on the beach. Whatever storm was coming, they'd weather it together. But first, he had to figure out how to keep their secret just a little bit longer, at least until after the finale. His shoulder throbbed, a constant reminder of all the plates he was trying to keep spinning. Something had to give. Tessa was right about that. He just prayed it wouldn't be everything falling apart at once. Blaze sat in his truck outside Lila's surf shop, gathering his courage. The conversation with Tessa's best friend couldn't wait, but his shoulder screamed for attention after another grueling practice. He popped 2 ibuprofen and headed inside, the familiar bell chiming above the door. "In the back," Lila called out. He found her organizing a rack of wetsuits, her usual cheerful expression replaced by concern, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Thanks for coming. What's going on?" Tessa got another offer. Lila crossed her arms, her fingers drumming anxiously against her bicep. "A big one. Photography position with a major sports magazine in San Francisco." The words hit him like a tackle he hadn't braced for, knocking the wind from his lungs. San Francisco. Hundreds of miles away. His chest tightened as memories of their stolen moments together flashed through his mind. "She hasn't told you yet," Lila said. It wasn't a question, her knowing eyes searching his face. "No." He leaned against a surfboard display, careful not to knock anything over with his broad frame. The familiar scent of surf wax and neoprene filled his nostrils. "When did she find out?" "Yesterday." "She's scared to tell you because—" Lila hesitated, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "Because she's actually considering it." Of course she was. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she deserved. The kind that could launch her career beyond small-town sports photography. Beyond the limitations of their secret relationship. Beyond him. "Look," Lila continued, stepping closer and lowering her voice, "I'm telling you this because you both need to be honest with each other. About everything." Her pointed look at his shoulder made him straighten defensively, ignoring the sharp twinge of pain. "I can handle. Save it for someone who hasn't known you since high school." She softened slightly, concern etching lines around her eyes. "Talk to her, Blaze. Really talk to her." He nodded, already reaching for his phone with slightly trembling fingers. "Meet me at the lighthouse? Need to talk." Tessa's reply came quickly, making his heart skip. "On my way." The sun was setting by the time she arrived, casting long shadows across the beach and painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. She looked beautiful in the fading light, her camera bag slung over one shoulder as always, her honey blonde hair catching the last rays of sun. His heart ached at the sight of her. "Hey," she said softly, settling beside him on their driftwood log, close enough that he could smell her familiar lavender shampoo. "Everything okay?" "I heard about San Francisco." He watched her face fall slightly, guilt flickering in her eyes. "From Lila. I was going to tell you." She fidgeted with her camera strap, a nervous habit he'd grown to love. "I just didn't know how." "Because you want to take it?" She was quiet for a long moment, the crash of waves filling the silence. "It's an amazing opportunity. The kind I've dreamed about." Her voice grew smaller, more vulnerable. "But I don't want to leave you." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Blaze took a deep breath, wincing at the pull in his shoulder that seemed to worsen with each passing day. "You're still hurting," she noticed immediately, her photographer's eye missing nothing. "Yeah." For once he didn't deny it, too exhausted to maintain the facade. "I'm scared, Tess. Terrified of letting everyone down. The team, your dad, you." He stared out at the waves, watching them chase each other to shore. "What if I can't play through this? What if I'm not good enough anymore?" She reached for his hand and he let her take it, savoring the warmth of her touch. "Is that why you've been pushing so hard?" "Partly." He squeezed her fingers, drawing strength from the connection. "But mostly because football and firefighting, they're all I know. All I'm good at. If I lose either one? That's not true. She turned his face toward her, her touch gentle but insistent. I've seen you with kids at community events. The way you mentor rookie firefighters. How you always know exactly what to say to calm someone during an emergency. Her thumb brushed his cheek, sending shivers down his spine. You're so much more than your injuries or your stats, Jason. The use of his real name, combined with a fierce belief in her voice, broke something open in his chest, releasing all the fears he'd been holding back. I'm scared of losing you too, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. To San Francisco or anything else. I'm scared too. She leaned her head against his good shoulder. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared together is better than being scared apart. He kissed her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. You should take the job. She pulled back to look at him. What? If it's what you want, you should take it. You're too talented to stay here just for me. But what about us? We'll figure it out. He managed a small smile. San Francisco's not that far. Tears welled in her eyes. I love you, she whispered. It was the first time either of them had said it. His heart soared even as his throat tightened with emotion he couldn't quite contain. I love you too, he whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and perfectly right. She kissed him then, soft and sweet, her hands careful of his injured shoulder. The gentleness of her touch made his chest ache in the best way. When they parted, she pressed her forehead to his, her breath warm against his face. No more hiding the pain, okay? Promise me. Promise. He meant it this time, tired of carrying the weight alone. And you'll tell your dad about us? Soon, she agreed, her fingers tracing patterns on his good arm. After the finale. When things calm down. The next day at practice, Blaze felt lighter despite his shoulder's persistent throb. He ran cleaner routes, caught more passes, and even managed to joke around with Tank between drills. The big linebacker's booming laugh echoed across the field. Big C watched from the sidelines, his expression thoughtful, clipboard forgotten in his hands. Better, Coach said during their water break, his gruff voice carrying approval. Still favoring that shoulder, but better. Working on it, sir. Blaze wiped sweat from his forehead, trying to keep his voice steady. Big C studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly. Whatever's changed, keep it up. Team needs you at your best. Blaze nodded, guilt twisting in his stomach like a knife. He spotted Tessa on the sidelines, pretending to photograph other players while stealing glances his way. The camera couldn't quite hide her smile. Their eyes met briefly and he couldn't help but smile back, warmth spreading through his chest. After practice they met at their spot again, the quiet stretch of beach behind the old pier. The sun hadn't quite set, painting everything in warm golden light that made Tessa's hair glow like honey. Perfect for photos, as she often said, though he thought she was more beautiful than any sunset. Got some good shots today, she told him, showing him her camera screen with obvious pride. Look at this one. It was him mid-catch, fully extended with the ball just touching his fingertips. The composition captured both power and grace, making even his slight grimace look artistic. The setting sun created a halo effect around him that seemed almost unreal. You make me look good, he said, fighting the urge to pull her close. You do that all on your own. She lowered the camera, her eyes sparkling. I told Lila about San Francisco. About us talking it through. Yeah. What did she say? His stomach fluttered at the mention of their earlier conversation. That we're both idiots for waiting this long to be honest with each other. Tessa grinned, nose crinkling adorably. And that she's glad we finally got our heads out of our Rivera. Big C's voice boomed across the beach like a thunderclap, making them both jump. What the hell is this? Blaze's stomach dropped to his feet as he turned to face Coach Caldwell. The older man stood at the top of the beach path, his face thunderous, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Dad, Tessa started, but Big C cut her off with a raised hand that brooked no argument. Inside. Both of you. Now. Each word fell like a hammer blow. They exchanged glances, knowing everything was about to change. Blaze reached for Tessa's hand, squeezing it once before letting go, drawing strength from her touch. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. He just hoped their love was strong enough to weather the storm heading their way. As they followed Big C toward the field house, Blaze caught sight of Lila watching from her shop window, concern etched on her face. He gave her a small nod, trying to convey that it would be okay. Even if he wasn't entirely sure it would be. Chapter 6: The Secret Exposed. Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched her father's face darken, his jaw clenching in that familiar way that always preceded a storm. The evening sun cast long shadows across the practice field, but the heat lingering in the air had nothing on the tension crackling between Coach Caldwell and Blaze. "What the hell is this?" Big C's voice was deceptively quiet, but Tessa knew better. She'd grown up learning to read the subtle shifts in his tone, the way his shoulders squared when he was about to explode. Her stomach twisted into knots as she watched the vein in his temple throb, the same way it had when she'd crashed his car at 16, when she'd announced she was majoring in photography instead of sports management. Blaze stepped forward, putting himself slightly between Tessa and her father. The protective gesture made her heart flutter, even as anxiety clawed at her chest. "Coach, I can explain." "Explain what, Rivera?" "How you've been sneaking around with my daughter, instead of focusing on getting that injury sorted?" Big C's voice rose with each word, echoing across the empty practice field. "I've watched you struggling through practices, seen your times dropping, and now this? I trusted you to be professional, to put the team first." "Dad, stop it." Tessa moved to stand beside Blaze, her fingers brushing against his arm. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her, giving her courage she didn't know she had. "This isn't about football." "The hell it isn't." Big C ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture so familiar it made Tessa's chest ache. She'd seen him do it countless times before games, during tough losses, through every major decision. "Everything in this town is about football, and you both know it. Rivera, you're one of my best players, but this is a distraction you can't afford right now. The team needs you focused." "With all due respect, Coach," Blaze's voice was steady, though Tessa could feel the tension radiating from him, could see the way his jaw clenched with each word. "My relationship with Tessa isn't affecting my performance. The injury is healing, and I'm giving everything I have to this team. Every practice, every game. Everything." Big C laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound made Tessa want to shrink away, but she forced herself to stand taller. "Is that why you've been missing catches you could make in your sleep? Why you're a half-second slower on every play? The team's counting on you, Rivera." Tessa felt Blaze flinch beside her, saw the way her father's words hit their mark, and something inside her snapped. The familiar frustration of being nothing more than Coach Caldwell's daughter, of having her whole life revolve around this team, bubbled over. "That's not fair, Dad. You can't blame every little setback on me. Blaze got hurt saving people from a fire, you know, his other job where he's actually risking his life to help people? Or does that not matter as much as catching a football?" "Tessa," both men said her name at the same time, but she wasn't finished. Years of pent-up emotions poured out of her like a broken dam. "No, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of everything in my life being measured against how it impacts the precious Sharks. I love this team, Dad, you know I do, but I'm not just Coach Caldwell's daughter. I'm a photographer, I have dreams of my own, and I'm falling for someone who sees me as more than just an extension of you." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she felt tears burning behind her eyes. The words hung in the air between them, and Tessa felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't meant to admit that last part, especially not like this, but there was no taking it back now. The look of surprise on Blaze's face made her heart skip a beat. Hey, what's with all the shouting?" Lila's voice cut through the tension as she jogged across the field, her usual easy smile slightly strained. Her long ponytail swung behind her as she moved. "I could hear you guys from the parking lot." "Stay out of this, Lila," Big C warned, but Lila just rolled her eyes, fearless as always in the face of his temper. "Yeah, because that's totally happening." She moved to stand next to Tessa, bumping her shoulder playfully. The familiar gesture nearly brought fresh tears to Tessa's eyes. "Look, Coach, I get that you're protective, but these two?" She gestured between Blaze and Tessa. They're both adults who are actually pretty great for each other when you think about it. I mean, who else is going to understand the pressure of being in the public eye in this town? Between your star player and your daughter, they're practically local celebrities. This isn't about, Big C started, but Lila held up a hand, her expression unusually serious. And before you go all football is life on us, maybe consider that having something or someone worth fighting for might actually make Blaze play better? I mean, have you seen the way he lights up when Tessa's around? It's kind of disgustingly adorable. Plus, she's been to every single game since she could walk. She knows this team almost as well as you do. Tessa shot her friend a grateful look, but her attention was drawn to Blaze as he stepped forward again. "Coach," he said, his voice low and serious, "I understand your concerns." "I do. But I need you to understand something too." He glanced at Tessa, and her breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. "What I feel for your daughter, it's not a distraction. It's motivation. When I'm on that field, I want to be better because she's watching. When I'm at the firehouse, knowing she believes in me makes me stronger." Tessa's heart squeezed at his words, even as she watched her father's expression shift from anger to something more complicated. She recognized that look. It was the same one he'd worn when she'd announced she was majoring in photography instead of sports management. "But if you're asking me to choose," Blaze continued, his voice steady and sure despite the tension crackling in the air, between the team and Tessa, "I won't do it. I can't. I'll work harder, train longer, do whatever it takes to prove to you that I can handle both, but I won't give her up." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions, thick enough that Tessa could barely breathe through it. She reached for Blaze's hand, lacing their fingers together, not caring anymore who saw. His palm was warm against hers, steadying her racing heart. "Dad," she said softly, willing her voice not to shake, "I know you want what's best for the team, for Blaze, for me. But you have to let me make my own choices. Let me find my own way. Just like Mom always told you to," she added silently. Big C looked between them, his expression unreadable. The tension in his shoulders hadn't entirely disappeared, but something in his eyes had shifted. Tessa recognized this too, the subtle softening around the edges that meant he was starting to bend. "You're both being stubborn as hell," he finally said, shaking his head. His signature scowl was still there, but it lacked its usual heat. "Rivera, if I see your performance slip." "You won't," Blaze cut in, squeezing Tessa's hand. The certainty in his voice made her chest tighten with emotion. "And you?" Big C turned to Tessa, his voice gruff but softer than before, the way it used to get when she'd had a nightmare as a child. "You really sure about this?" Tessa met her father's gaze steadily, drawing strength from Blaze's grip on her hand. "I'm sure about him." "Well," Lila piped up, grinning that infectious grin that had gotten them both into and out of trouble countless times, "this is way better than my afternoon soap operas. Though I gotta say, Coach, you could work on your delivery. Maybe throw in a dramatic, 'How could you?' next time?" "Carson," Big C growled, but there was a hint of reluctant amusement in his tone that made Tessa's hopes soar even higher. Tessa felt some of the tension drain from her body, though her heart was still racing. She looked up at Blaze, saw the mix of guilt and determination in his expression, and knew this wasn't over. There would be more conversations, more challenges, more moments where they'd have to prove themselves. Tessa watched her father's expression shift through a kaleidoscope of emotions before settling into something that resembled resignation, mixed with determination. The practice field had emptied, leaving just the four of them standing in the fading light. "One chance," Big C said, his voice gruff but steady. "That's all I'm offering here." He turned to Blaze, fixing him with the same intense stare he used when drilling plays. "You prove to me that this isn't going to affect your game, Rivera. I need 110% focus when you're on this field." Tessa's stomach twisted. She hated being viewed as a potential problem, but she understood her father's position, even if she didn't agree with it. The way he looked at them reminded her of all those times he'd caught her sneaking out as a teenager, that mix of disappointment and protective instinct that only fathers seemed capable of mastering. Beside her, Blaze stood straighter, his shoulder brushing against hers in a subtle show of support that made her heart flutter. "You'll get it, Coach," Blaze said. "I promise you won't regret this." Big C's eyes narrowed. And you? He turned to Tessa, his expression softening just slightly the way it always did when he looked at her. I know you've got that photography contest coming up. Don't let any of this, he gestured vaguely between her and Blaze, derail what you're working toward. You've got talent, kid. Real talent. The unexpected praise caught Tessa off guard, warmth blooming in her chest. It wasn't often her father acknowledged her pursuits outside of the football world. Thanks, Dad, she managed, her voice slightly rough with emotion. Lila, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the whole confrontation, broke into a grin. See? Was that so hard? Now we can all go back to our regularly scheduled drama, just with less sneaking around and more actual communication. Carson, Big C warned, but Tessa caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, that tiny tell she'd learned to spot years ago when he was trying not to show amusement. I should head to the firehouse, Blaze said, checking his watch. Early shift tomorrow. Big C nodded curtly and started walking toward his office, but paused after a few steps. Rivera, he called back without turning around. Ice that shoulder. Can't have you favoring it during Saturday's game. After her father disappeared into his office, Tessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders sagging with relief. Well, that was intense, Lila supplied. Dramatic? Slightly terrifying, but ultimately successful? All of the above, Tessa laughed weakly, leaning into Blaze's side. The solid warmth of him was reassuring, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, making her feel safe and protected despite the emotional whirlwind of the past few minutes. I'll catch you guys later, Lila said with a knowing smile that made Tessa blush. Try not to cause any more family drama while I'm gone. I hate missing the good stuff. She headed off toward her car, leaving Tessa and Blaze alone in the growing shadows of early evening. You okay? Blaze asked softly, turning to face her, his expression full of concern. Tessa nodded, reaching up to trace the worried line between his brows with gentle fingers. Are you? Dad wasn't exactly gentle about the injury thing. I'm fine. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent tingles up her arm. He's right, I need to focus more during practice. But Tessa. His green eyes locked with hers, intense and sincere in a way that made her breath catch. What I said before? I meant it. All of it. Heat bloomed in her cheeks as she remembered his words about her being motivation rather than distraction, the memory making her pulse quicken. I know you did. She stood on her tiptoes, pressing a soft kiss to his jaw. Those are the ones where I look like I've been through hell and back? His voice held a hint of self-consciousness that made her heart ache. Those are the ones where you look like a hero, she corrected, warmth flooding her chest as she gazed up at him. Because you are one. He ducked his head and she loved that she could still make him blush, the way his ears turned slightly pink at the tips. Just doing my job. Well, your job makes for amazing photographs. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly with excitement as she pulled up her favorite shot from the series. In it, Blaze was emerging from smoke, his face streaked with soot but determination clear in every line of his body as he carried a young girl to safety. The image still gave her chills, even after dozens of viewings. See? This is what I want to capture. Real moments, real emotion, real heroes. Blaze studied the photo, his expression thoughtful, one calloused finger tracing the edge of her screen. You really do have a gift, you know that? You see things differently than anyone else. That's what I'm hoping the judges think too. She tucked her phone away, suddenly serious, her stomach knotting with familiar anxiety. I need to prove I can do this. That I'm more than just Coach Caldwell's daughter, or the girl who takes pictures of the local football team. Hey. Blaze tilted her chin up with gentle fingers, making her meet his eyes, those warm brown depths that never failed to make her pulse quicken. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. But I get it. And for what it's worth, I believe in you completely. Tessa felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back, overwhelmed by the absolute certainty in his voice. Thank you, she whispered, then managed a watery laugh, trying to lighten the moment. God, when did we get so serious? Probably around the time your dad caught us making out behind the bleachers like teenagers, Blaze teased, and just like that the heavy moment lifted, replaced by the warmth of shared memory. Oh God, don't remind me. She buried her face in his chest, feeling it rumble with his laughter, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with a hint of smoke that never quite seemed to leave him. That was mortifying. Worth it though, he murmured into her hair, his arms tightening around her, and she couldn't help but agree, remembering how even her father's thunderous expression hadn't dampened the thrill of finally being able to show their feelings openly. They stood there for a moment longer, just holding each other as the evening settled around them, the distant sound of waves providing a peaceful backdrop. Finally, Blaze pulled back with a regretful sigh. I really do need to get to the station. I know. Tessa straightened his collar, letting her hands linger on the sturdy material of his uniform shirt. Be safe tonight, okay? Always am. He caught her hands, pressing a kiss to each palm that sent shivers down her spine. Good luck with the contest prep. You're going to blow them away. And you're going to kill it at practice, she returned, fierce pride in her voice. Show Dad he made the right choice. Blaze's expression turned determined, his jaw setting in that way she'd come to recognize meant business. Count on it. She pushed up on her toes, kissing him softly, savoring the gentle press of his lips against hers. When she pulled back, his eyes were darker, more intense, making her breath catch. Go, she laughed, pushing at his chest. Before I change my mind and keep you here. Yes, ma'am. He stole one more quick kiss before stepping back, his smile making her heart flip. Text me later? Promise. Tessa watched him jog toward the parking lot, her heart full and racing at the same time. The past hour had been a whirlwind of emotions, but standing here now she felt oddly peaceful. Maybe it was knowing they didn't have to hide anymore, or maybe it was finally standing up to her father, but something had shifted. The future stretched out before her, bright with possibility, and for once she wasn't afraid to reach for it. She pulled out her camera, unable to resist capturing one last shot of Blaze's silhouette against the setting sun. Through her lens she could see the strength in his stride, the purpose in his movements. This was the man she was falling for, dedicated, brave, and willing to fight for what mattered. And somehow, incredibly, she mattered to him. With a smile, she lowered her camera and headed toward her own car. She had a photography contest to prepare for, and now more than ever, she was determined to show everyone exactly what she could do. Chapter 7: Building Bridges. Blaze hit the field running, his cleats digging into the turf with renewed determination. The morning sun beat down on his shoulders as he pushed through another round of sprints, his muscles burning with each stride. His injury twinged, but he gritted his teeth and powered through it. He had something to prove now, to coach, to his teammates, and most importantly to himself. Looking sharp out there, Rivera? Marcus called from the sidelines, tossing him a water bottle. That extra speed training's paying off. Blaze caught the bottle one-handed, allowing himself a small grin as the cool plastic settled against his palm. Thanks, man. Still got work to do, though. He couldn't help but glance at his phone during their water break, knowing Tessa would be setting up her photography display right about now. Her portfolio had looked amazing last night when she'd shown him, her eyes bright with nervous excitement as she explained each shot. The way she'd lingered over that black and white photo of the Sunset Pier, describing how she'd captured the light just right, it had made his heart swell with pride. His thumb hovered over her last text, nervous as hell but ready. He wanted to respond, to tell her she'd knocked their socks off, to remind her how talented she was, but Coach's whistle cut through his thoughts like a knife. Let's go. Formation drills. Big C's voice boomed across the field, carrying that familiar edge of intensity. Rivera, you're up first. Blaze tucked his phone away and jogged back onto the field, his cleats digging into the precisely trimmed grass. The familiar rhythm of practice settled into his bones as he ran his routes, each cut sharper than the last. His teammates' energy felt different today, more supportive, less competitive. Even Tommy, who usually gave him grief about everything from his catching style to his choice of sports drinks, was offering up high fives after particularly good catches. The change felt good, like maybe they could sense he was finally finding his footing again. Man, whatever's got you fired up lately, keep it going. Derek said during a brief break between drills, passing him a towel. "You're making the rest of us look bad." Blaze wiped sweat from his forehead, catching Coach watching him with an unreadable expression that made his stomach tighten. Those steel-gray eyes had a way of seeing right through him, and he couldn't help wondering if they saw more than just his improved performance. "Just trying to be better," he replied, focusing on keeping his voice steady. The morning wore on, and Blaze found himself settling into a groove he hadn't felt in weeks. His focus was razor-sharp, his movements precise. Even his injuries seemed to fade into the background as he concentrated on each play, each catch, each moment. The familiar burn in his muscles felt good now, productive rather than painful. He was starting to feel like himself again, maybe even better than before. "Hold up." Drew's voice cut through the field chatter. The assistant coach jogged over, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable beneath the morning sun. "Rivera, got a minute?" Blaze followed Drew to the sidelines, his heart rate picking up for reasons that had nothing to do with physical exertion. But Drew's expression wasn't stern. If anything, there was a hint of understanding in his eyes that made Blaze wonder just how much the assistant coach had figured out. Drew had always been more perceptive than most. "You're looking good out there today," Drew said, leaning against the water cooler and crossing his arms. "Different." Blaze took a long drink from his water bottle, buying time to find the right words. The cool water helped clear his head, washing away the taste of uncertainty. "Been working on finding the right balance." "Yeah." Drew's mouth quirked up at one corner, a knowing look crossing his face. "Between football and firefighting? Or between football and something else?" Heat crept up Blaze's neck that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He fought the urge to glance toward his phone where Tessa's text waited. His fingers itched to check it, to make sure she was okay. "Both, I guess." "All of it." Drew nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful as he watched the other players running drills. "You know, when I was playing pro, I thought football had to be everything. Thought anything else would be a distraction." He paused, scratching his chin, lost in memories for a moment. "Took a career-ending injury for me to realize how wrong I was." "How'd you figure it out?" Blaze asked, genuinely curious, recognizing the weight of experience in Drew's words. He found himself leaning in slightly, drawn to the quiet wisdom in the assistant coach's tone. "Realize that being well-rounded, having people in your corner, having passions outside the game, it doesn't make you weaker. Makes you stronger." Drew's gaze was steady, almost brotherly. "Makes you play better, actually. Gives you something to play for beyond just the game." Blaze let those words sink in, thinking about Tessa at her photography contest, probably arranging her photos with that determined look she got when she was in her element, the same look she'd given him when he'd tried to downplay his injury. The thought made him stand a little straighter, made his chest feel lighter somehow. "Your head's in a better place," Drew continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd walked a similar path. "Coach sees it too, even if he's not ready to admit it yet. Just keep doing what you're doing. Sometimes the best plays aren't the ones we draw up on the board, they're the ones that come from knowing exactly who we are and what we're fighting for." From the corner of his eye, Blaze caught Big C watching them, his usual scowl softened slightly. The coach gave a short nod before turning back to bark orders at the defensive line, but that brief acknowledgement spoke volumes. "Thanks, Coach," Blaze said, meaning it more than he could express. "All right, enough heart-to-heart," Drew grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Show me that new route we've been working on. And this time, try not to make it look so damn easy." Blaze laughed and jogged back onto the field, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. His phone buzzed in his bag, probably Tessa updating him on the contest, but for once he didn't feel the urgent need to check it. She was crushing it, he knew that much. And he was right where he needed to be, doing what he needed to do, finally finding his footing both on and off the field. The familiar smell of fresh-cut grass and the warmth of the morning sun on his face only reinforced that feeling. The rest of practice flew by in a blur of plays, catches, and surprisingly genuine encouragement from his teammates. His body moved with renewed confidence, each route crisp and precise. Even Big C's criticism felt more constructive than cutting, his gruff, "better" after a particularly challenging play carrying more weight than usual. For the first time in months, Blaze felt like all the pieces of his life were starting to fit together, even if the edges were still a little rough. The nagging ache in his shoulder had faded to a dull whisper, more memory than pain. As they wrapped up, several players lingered on the field, the usual post-practice banter taking on a different tone. The morning dew was burning off the grass, leaving behind that distinct earthy scent that always reminded him of game days. "Hey Rivera," Tommy called out, tossing him a towel. "Some of us are grabbing breakfast at Sandy's. You should come. Been a while since you joined us." The invitation carried a weight of understanding that made Blaze's throat tight. Blaze caught the towel, wiping his face as he noted the genuine invitation in Tommy's voice. These were the guys who'd had his back through countless games, who'd checked on him after the fire, who'd noticed his struggles even when he tried to hide them. The same ones who'd covered his shifts without complaint when his injury had been at its worst. Maybe it was time to stop keeping everyone at arm's length. "Yeah," he said, surprising himself with how much he wanted to go. The words felt right in his mouth. "Yeah, I'll be there." As they headed toward the locker room, Big C stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. The coach's expression was gruff but not unkind, his eyes carrying that same intensity they had when he was plotting game-winning strategies. "Good work today, son," he said quietly. "Keep that focus, and we might just have a shot at the championship." He paused, then added, tell her good luck with her contest." The words held more than just well wishes, they carried acceptance, however grudging. Blaze blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected support. His chest tightened with emotion he couldn't quite name. "Yes, sir. I will." He watched Big C walk away, then finally pulled out his phone. 3 messages from Tessa waited for him. "Just finished setting up. These judges look terrifying." "Oh God," one of them actually smiled. "Is that good or bad?" "They love the Fire series. Especially the close-ups. Maybe you're my good luck charm after all." Grinning, he typed back a quick response. "Never doubted you for a second. Killing it in practice too. Your dad says good luck." He could almost see her surprised smile as she read that last part. Tucking his phone away, he headed to the locker room, ready to join his teammates for breakfast. For the first time in a long while, everything felt like it was falling into place. Blaze stared at his phone, reading Tessa's text for the 3rd time. His heart raced faster than it did during his most intense workouts. "The magazine wants to feature my work. Not just the sports shots, they love the whole portfolio. Especially the Firefighter series." Pride swelled in his chest. He'd known she was talented, had seen it in the way she captured moments others missed. But this was huge. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard, trying to find the right words to express how proud he was, without sounding like a complete sap. "Earth to Blaze." Lila's voice cut through his thoughts. He looked up to find her leaning against the doorframe of the firehouse kitchen, arms crossed, and wearing that knowing smirk she seemed to reserve just for him. "You've been staring at that phone like it holds the secrets of the universe." "Tessa got the magazine feature," he said, unable to keep the grin off his face. "They want to run her work in next month's issue." Lila's face lit up. "That's amazing. Though not surprising, my girl's got serious talent." She dropped into the chair across from him, her expression turning more serious. "You know what this could mean for her career, right?" Blaze's stomach tightened. He did know. Regional exposure could lead to bigger opportunities, assignments that might take her away from Oceanview. Away from him. "Yeah, I know." "Hey." Lila kicked his shin under the table, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to get his attention. "Stop doing that thing where you overthink everything until you convince yourself it's better to pull back. Tessa needs your support right now, not your protective instincts kicking into overdrive." "I'm not," he started, but Lila's raised eyebrow stopped him. She knew him too well. "Fine. Maybe I am. But you've seen how focused she gets on her work. How passionate she is about it. What if she becomes successful doing what she loves?" Lila finished for him. "Just like you did with football and firefighting?" The horror. Her voice softened. "Look, I get it. You're worried about losing what you have. But holding her back? That's the surest way to lose her. Blaze ran a hand through his hair, knowing Lila was right. He thought about how Tessa's eyes lit up when she talked about photography, how alive she looked behind the camera. It was the same fire he felt on the field or rushing into a burning building, that sense of purpose, of being exactly where you were meant to be. I need to write her something, he said suddenly, pushing back from the table. Before she gets back. Something to let her know. That you're not just another overprotective guy trying to clip her wings? Lila supplied helpfully. Something like that. He headed to his locker, pulling out the notebook he kept for shift reports. Tearing out a clean page, he started writing, letting the words flow without overthinking them. An hour later, he found himself at the stadium, the letter sealed in an envelope in his back pocket. The field was quiet, just the sound of the sprinklers and Big C's voice drifting from his office. Blaze hesitated, then knocked on the open door. Rivera. Big C looked up from his playbook, his expression unreadable. Practice isn't for another 3 hours. I know, coach. I just... Blaze shifted his weight, feeling like a rookie all over again. Wanted to talk, if you have a minute. Big C studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. About football or about my daughter? Both maybe. Blaze sat, gathering his thoughts. Tessa got that magazine feature. I heard. A hint of pride crept into Big C's voice. She's got her mother's eye for capturing moments. And her old man's stubborn determination. She does, Blaze agreed, a small smile tugging at his lips. Coach, I need you to know something. I'd never ask her to choose between her dreams and anything else. She's too talented, too driven. And that's part of why. He trailed off, realizing he was about to admit more than he'd planned. Part of why you care about her. Big C finished, his voice gruffer than usual. He leaned back in his chair, looking older and somehow more human than Blaze had ever seen him. Listen, son. I've watched you push through injuries, led this team through tough losses, run into burning buildings without hesitation. You've got good judgment. Most of the time. He paused, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. Maybe dating my daughter isn't your worst decision. Blaze felt something in his chest loosen. Thank you, coach. Don't thank me yet. You still have to help us win this championship. Big C's expression turned serious again. And Rivera? Make sure whatever's in that envelope you've been fidgeting with is worthy of her. Blaze touched the letter in his pocket, surprised Big C had noticed. Yes, sir. He left the office feeling lighter, more certain of his path forward. Checking his watch, he saw he had just enough time before practice to stop by Tessa's darkroom and leave the letter. She'd be back tomorrow, and he wanted her to find it when she first walked in. The familiar chemical smell hit him as he entered her workspace. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, organized chaos as she called it. He placed the envelope where she couldn't miss it, propped against her favorite lens. His words stared back at him. Tessa. I've never been great with words, you're the artist in this relationship. But I need you to know something. Watching you chase your dreams, seeing how your face lights up when you're behind the camera, it makes me want to be better. Braver. Not just on the field or at the firehouse, but in all the ways that matter. Your talent amazes me. Not just because you're good, though you are, incredibly so, but because you pour your whole heart into every shot. You see beauty in moments others miss. You caught me at my strongest and my most vulnerable, and somehow made both look like art. I know this feature is just the beginning for you. And I want you to know I'm in your corner, completely. Whatever comes next, whether it's assignments across the country or around the world, I'm proud of you. And I'm here cheering you on just like you've been there for me. Chase every dream, capture every moment. You've got this. The next afternoon, Blaze was running drills when he heard her voice. So this is what a future championship team looks like? He turned to find Tessa standing at the sidelines, camera in hand, looking more confident than he'd ever seen her. The sight of her made his heart skip. She was practically glowing with success. Depends, he called back, jogging over. This is what a future award-winning photographer looks like? Her smile widened. Maybe. I got your letter. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. It was perfect. You're perfect. Hardly. He fought the urge to pull her close, aware of the team's eyes on them. But I meant every word. I know you did. She reached out, squeezing his hand quickly. That's what makes it perfect. Chapter 8. The final game begins. Tessa adjusted her camera settings as she watched the crowd fill the stands of Oceanview Stadium. She'd photographed countless games before, but tonight felt different. The energy crackled through the air like lightning before a storm, electric and unpredictable. Even the usually laid-back locals seemed to buzz with anticipation, their faces painted in the Sharks' navy and silver. Getting some good shots? Lila appeared beside her, sporting a vintage Sharks jersey and holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Tessa, the familiar aroma of her friend's signature caramel blend wafting up between them. Thanks. Tessa took a grateful sip, letting the warmth chase away the evening chill. And yeah, the pre-game atmosphere is incredible. Look at this. She showed Lila a candid shot of 2 young boys, their faces painted like sharks, pressing against the fence to watch the players warm up. The stadium lights caught the silver glitter in their face paint, making their eyes sparkle with pure joy. That's totally going in the feature spread, Lila said, grinning. Speaking of which, have you told a certain someone about getting that gig with Coast and Field magazine? Tessa's cheeks warmed as she spotted Blaze on the field, running drills with his teammates. Even from this distance, she could see the intensity in his movements, the way he pushed through each sprint with determination etched across his features. His navy practice jersey clung to his shoulders, damp with sweat despite the cool evening air. She raised her camera, capturing the moment his cleats dug into the turf, his muscles coiled like springs. I haven't had the chance, Tessa admitted, adjusting her lens to follow his movement. He's been so focused on the game, and I didn't want to distract him. The playoffs are everything right now. Girl, you're already a distraction. Lila bumped her shoulder playfully, nearly making Tessa spill her coffee. Might as well be a positive one. Besides, he looks at you like you hung the moon every time you show up at practice. Tessa's lens found Blaze again as he caught a practice pass, his movements fluid despite the injury she knew still bothered him. She'd noticed him favoring his left side during practice, though he'd brush off any concern with that quiet smile of his. The same smile that made her heart skip every time he directed it her way. The crowd's murmur grew louder as her father stepped onto the field, his familiar weathered clipboard tucked under one arm. Coach Charlie Big C Caldwell commanded attention without trying, his presence drawing all eyes as he gathered the team. Tessa zoomed in, catching the moment when his stern expression softened ever so slightly as he looked at his players. She recognized that look. It was the same one he used to give her before her dance recitals, proud and protective all at once. Listen up, Big C's voice carried across the field, cutting through the stadium noise like a knife through butter. You've all worked your tails off to get here. Every practice, every drill, every moment of sweat and pain has led to tonight. Tessa's camera clicked rapidly, capturing the way the players leaned in, hanging on every word. She paused on Blaze's face, noting the subtle shift in his expression as her father continued. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she wished she could reach out and smooth away the tension she saw there. Some of you have faced personal challenges this season. Big C's gaze flickered briefly to Blaze, lingering just long enough to make Tessa's breath catch, and come out stronger for it. That's what being a shark is about, not just surviving the rough waters but learning to thrive in them. The tension in Blaze's shoulders eased slightly, and Tessa felt her own breath catch at the barely perceptible nod her father gave him. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close to acceptance. She captured that moment too, knowing it would mean something to both men someday. Now get out there and show them what Oceanview is made of. Big C's voice boomed across the field, met with thunderous cheers from the crowd. The sound reverberated through Tessa's chest, mixing with her own racing heartbeat. As the teams took their positions, Tessa moved along the sidelines, her camera ready. The opposing team, the Harbor City Titans, lived up to their name, Their players towered over most of the Sharks, their jerseys stretched across impressive builds. The visitors section blazed with their signature red and gold, a stark contrast to the sea of navy and silver filling the home stands. The whistle blew, and the game erupted into motion. Tessa tracked the action through her viewfinder, but her attention kept returning to Blaze. He moved with purpose, finding gaps in the defense that seemed impossible to spot. His speed had earned him his nickname, and tonight he was living up to it, leaving defenders grasping at air. When the ball came his way early in the first quarter, she held her breath, her finger hovering over the shutter release. Time seemed to slow as Blaze accelerated down the field, his feet barely touching the ground. The pass spiraled toward him, and Tessa could see the moment he pushed off his injured side, reaching for the ball. Pain flashed across his features, but his hands were sure as they plucked the ball from the air. She winced, knowing exactly how much that catch must have cost him. The crowd exploded as Blaze gained crucial yards, setting up the Sharks' first scoring opportunity. Tessa's camera captured it all, the determination in his stride, the grace of his catch, the fierce joy in his eyes as his teammates surrounded him. Through her lens, she saw him glance toward her position, and for just a moment, that familiar warmth bloomed in her chest as their eyes met across the field. But she also caught what others might miss, the slight grimace as he jogged back to position, the way he rolled his shoulder when he thought no one was watching, the barely perceptible limp he was trying so hard to hide. Her stomach twisted with worry even as pride swelled in her chest. After all their private conversations about his recovery, she knew exactly how much this meant to him. "That's my boy," Lila shouted beside her, jumping up and down, her enthusiasm infectious as always. "Did you get that catch on camera? Please tell me you got it." "Every second," Tessa confirmed, reviewing the shots quickly on her display screen. Each one told a story, not just of an amazing play, but of a man pushing through pain to prove himself, to show he could balance his heart and his commitment to the team. The determination in his eyes, the perfect form of his catch despite everything, these were the moments that made her fall for him all over again. The game was far from over, and the Titans were already adjusting their defense to counter Blaze's speed, their cornerbacks pressing closer to the line. But that one play had shifted something in the stadium's atmosphere, electrifying the crowd and energizing the sidelines. The Sharks weren't just here to compete, they were here to win, and everyone could feel it. Tessa lowered her camera for a moment, catching Blaze's eye across the field through the chaos of players and officials. He gave her that small private smile that made her heart skip, the one that belonged to her alone, and she knew that win or lose, something more important than football had already been won between them. Through her camera lens, Tessa tracked Blaze's movements across the field, her heart racing with each play. The first quarter had shown promise, but the Titans were proving to be formidable opponents, their defense reading plays with uncanny accuracy. Every time she caught sight of Blaze favoring his left side, her stomach clenched with worry, knowing how stubborn he could be about playing through pain. Come on," she whispered, lowering her camera for a moment to watch directly as the Sharks lined up for another play. The score remained close, too close for comfort, and the tension in the stadium was palpable, crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Blaze positioned himself wide, and Tessa could read the exhaustion in his stance even as he maintained perfect form. She raised her camera again, focusing on his face. Through the zoom lens, she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that betrayed his discomfort, the barely perceptible grimace that no one else would notice. Her finger hesitated on the shutter, torn between capturing the moment and wanting to look away. The ball snapped, and chaos erupted on the field. Tessa followed the action through her viewfinder, watching as Marcus, their rookie receiver, cut across the field. The play looked perfect until Marcus stumbled, his cleats catching on the turf at precisely the wrong moment, missing his route by mere inches. The pass sailed over his head, spinning perfectly through the evening air before landing in the waiting arms of a Titans defender. The crowd groaned collectively, the sound echoing off the stadium walls. Tessa's heart sank as she captured the aftermath, Marcus's devastated expression, the slump of his shoulders telling its own story, the Titans' celebration and Blaze's immediate reaction. Instead of showing frustration, he jogged over to Marcus, placing a steady hand on the rookie's shoulder, his movements deliberate despite the obvious fatigue. He's good with them, Lila commented beside her, adjusting her own position on the sidelines to get a better view. Who knew my brother's best friend was such a natural leader? Tessa smiled, snapping a few shots of the interaction, admiring how the stadium lights caught the determination in Blaze's eyes. He's always been like that. People just don't usually notice because he's so quiet about it. It's one of the things that makes him special. The first half wound down with the Sharks trailing by 10 points, each minute feeling longer than the last. As the teams headed toward the locker rooms, Tessa caught sight of Blaze gathering his teammates in a tight huddle near the sideline. She moved closer, her camera capturing the intensity of the moment, the way the players instinctively leaned in to hear his words. "Listen up," Blaze's voice carried just far enough for her to hear, low and steady like always. "That first half. That's not who we are. Marcus, shake it off. We've all made mistakes, but it's how we bounce back that matters. Every single one of us has been there." Tessa's chest tightened as she watched the team respond to his words, her lens capturing the subtle transformations in their faces. Even the veterans were nodding, their expressions shifting from defeat to determination. She kept shooting, knowing these moments were just as important as any touchdown, maybe even more so. "We're the Sharks," Blaze continued, his quiet intensity drawing everyone in, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And what do sharks do when they smell blood in the water? They attack." The team responded in unison, their energy visibly lifting, the sound reverberating across the field like thunder. As the huddle broke apart, Tessa noticed her father approaching Blaze, his face set in that expression she knew all too well. She held her breath, camera poised, as Big C pulled Blaze aside. The stadium lights cast long shadows across their faces, but she could see the shift in her father's usually stern expression, the way his features softened just slightly as he spoke to the man who, without either of them knowing it, had become so much more than just another player to both of them. "That's what this team needs," Big C said, his voice gruff but warm, reminding Tessa of countless pep talks she'd heard him give over the years. "That fire, that leadership. You've proved me wrong, Rivera. Now go prove everyone else wrong too." Tessa's finger pressed the shutter button rapidly, capturing the surprise that flickered across Blaze's face, followed by a determined nod. The moment was brief but powerful, and she felt tears prick at her eyes as she lowered her camera. She'd never seen her father look at any player quite the way he was looking at Blaze now, with a mixture of pride and something deeper, almost paternal. "Did you get that?" Lila asked softly, nudging Tessa's shoulder. "Yeah," Tessa whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "I got it." The second half started with an entirely different energy. The Sharks moved with renewed purpose, their plays sharper, their defense stronger. Tessa could hardly keep up with all the moments she wanted to capture. The perfect blocks, the precise passes, the way the team seemed to anticipate each other's movements. Her camera clicked frantically as she tried to freeze each second of their transformation. Blaze was everywhere at once, making impossible catches look easy, creating opportunities where none seemed to exist. Even when he took a hard hit that made Tessa's heart stop for a moment, he bounced back up, that quiet determination never wavering. Her camera followed him religiously, documenting every triumph and setback as the Sharks slowly closed the gap. She told herself it was just for the team photos, but she knew better. With 5 minutes left in the game, the score stood at 24-21, Titans still leading. The stadium hummed with nervous energy as the teams lined up for what could be their final drive. Through her lens, Tessa watched as Blaze adjusted his helmet, his movements deliberate and focused. She recognized the slight roll of his shoulders, the way he bounced on his toes, tells she'd learned to read over the season. The sun had nearly set, casting the field in dramatic shadows and making her job more challenging, but Tessa wouldn't have moved from her spot for anything. She could see the way Blaze was gathering himself, that familiar stillness settling over him that meant he was completely in the zone. The stadium lights caught the silver of his jersey, making him seem to glow against the darkening sky. "Rivera's got something planned," her father muttered nearby, his clipboard forgotten in his hands. "Look at him." The note of anticipation in his voice made Tessa's pulse quicken. Tessa was looking. She hadn't stopped looking since the game began. Through her camera she watched as Blaze shared a quick glance with their quarterback, some silent communication passing between them. Whatever was coming next, she knew it would be something worth capturing, something that would tell the story of this night perfectly. The crowd rose to their feet as the teams took their positions, the energy building like a wave about to break. Tessa adjusted her camera settings one last time, her heart pounding in rhythm with the crowd's chants. The moment felt electric, charged with possibility. "Let's go Sharks! Let's go Sharks!" Blaze crouched at the line of scrimmage, perfectly still except for the slight rise and fall of his chest. Tessa held her breath, her finger hovering over the shutter button, waiting for what would come next. Chapter 9: Victory and Vulnerability. The roar of the crowd faded to a distant hum as Blaze locked eyes with Drew across the field. 4th down, 12 seconds left on the clock, and they were down by 4 points. This was it, their shot at redemption, at proving everyone wrong about the scrappy semi-pro team from Oceanview. The weight of the moment pressed down on his chest, mixing with the familiar pre-play tension he'd felt 1,000 times before. His shoulder throbbed, a constant reminder of the fire rescue that had nearly derailed his season. The memory of smoke and heat flashed through his mind, the little girl's terrified face, the cracking beam, the split-second decision that had saved her life but nearly cost him everything he'd worked for. But right now, with everything on the line, the pain felt distant, secondary to the surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Drew called the play and Blaze knew. This was his moment. He could read it in Drew's stance, in the slight nod that passed between them. They'd practiced this exact scenario countless times, staying late after everyone else had gone home. The ball snapped. Blaze exploded off the line, his cleats digging into the turf as he cut sharply left, then right, losing his defender in the process. The move was pure instinct now, muscle memory built from years of practice. The stadium lights blurred above him as he sprinted toward the end zone, his legs burning with effort. The familiar smell of grass and sweat filled his nostrils, grounding him in the moment. He glanced over his shoulder just in time to see Drew release the ball, a perfect spiral cutting through the evening air. Time seemed to slow as Blaze tracked its arc, knowing this catch would define not just the game, but everything he'd fought for this season. His recovery, his place on the team, his future with Tessa, it all hung in the balance. The ball descended, and Blaze leapt, extending his body fully. His fingers closed around the leather, just as a defensive back slammed into his side. The impact jarred his injured shoulder, sending a bolt of white-hot pain through his body, but Blaze held on, tucking the ball tight against his chest as he crashed to the ground, rolling into the end zone. The synthetic turf burned against his exposed skin, but he barely felt it. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the referee's arms shot up, and the stadium erupted. "Touchdown Sharks!" His teammates mobbed him before he could even get to his feet. Tank and Ethan hoisted him onto their shoulders as the crowd stormed the field. Through the chaos, Blaze caught glimpses of familiar faces, Drew pumping his fist in the air, Coach Charlie fighting back tears, and Tessa, her camera raised, capturing it all. He wanted to freeze this moment, to remember every detail, the taste of victory in the air, the deafening roar of the crowd, the pride shining in everyone's eyes. "That's how you do it, Rivera," Tank shouted over the noise, his deep voice booming with joy. "Championship material, baby." The celebration was a blur of blue and silver jerseys, thunderous cheers, and backslapping congratulations. Someone had dumped the water cooler over Drew's head, and the coach was laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in weeks. The cold water had soaked through his shirt, making him look more like a drowned rat than a victorious coach, but his smile could have lit up the whole stadium. When his teammates finally set him down, Blaze found himself face to face with Coach Charlie. The older man's expression was unreadable for a moment, and Blaze felt his heart rate spike again, different from the game-winning anxiety but just as intense. He could smell the familiar mix of coffee and mint that always seemed to follow the coach. "Son," Coach Charlie said, extending his hand. "That was one hell of a catch." Blaze grasped it firmly, noticing the slight tremor in the coach's grip. The calloused palm against his own spoke of years spent molding young players into men. "Thank you, sir." "Listen," Coach continued, his voice gruff but sincere. "I may have been hard on you these past few weeks, but you proved something out there tonight. Not just about football, but about character. He glanced over Blaze's shoulder, where Tessa was approaching with her camera. About knowing what matters and fighting for it. The words hit Blaze harder than any tackle. His throat tightened with emotion. I wouldn't have made it without the team, he said, thinking of all the late-night practice sessions and physical therapy appointments his teammates had supported him through. Without everyone's support. Including my daughters? Coach Charlie's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, a hint of understanding passing between them. Especially hers, Blaze admitted, his heart swelling with the truth of it. Coach nodded slowly, something shifting in his stern expression. Well then, I suppose I should stop fighting the inevitable. He cleared his throat, adjusting his ever-present whistle. Just take care of her, Rivera. She's got big dreams just like you. Before Blaze could respond, Tessa was there, her camera hanging around her neck, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. Her presence filled his senses, the light floral scent of her shampoo, the warmth radiating from her smile. Coach Charlie squeezed Blaze's shoulder once more, then stepped away, giving them space. In that moment, victory had never tasted sweeter. You did it, Tessa said softly, reaching up to brush a smudge of dirt from his cheek. I knew you would. Blaze caught her hand, holding it against his face for a moment. You never stopped believing in me, even when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. That's because I saw you, she said. Not just the football star or the firefighter, but you. The guy who pushes himself because he cares so much about others. The one who's afraid of letting people down, but never stops trying anyway. Her phone buzzed and she pulled it out, her eyes widening as she read the message. Oh my God, she breathed. What is it? Blaze's heart skipped, wondering if something had gone wrong despite their victory. The magazine, they want the shots from tonight. They're expanding the spread to include the championship game. They're calling it the heart of small-town sports and... She looked up at him, her smile radiant. They want to feature your story. The firefighter who helped save the Sharks season. Blaze pulled her close, not caring who was watching. His body still hummed with adrenaline from the game, but holding her brought a different kind of electricity altogether. I'm so proud of you, he murmured against her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the night air. You deserve this. All of it. We both do, she said, wrapping her arms around his waist. Her touch was gentle against his sore muscles. Sometimes the best things in life come when you're brave enough to break the rules a little. Around them the celebration continued, teammates hugging, fans cheering, camera flashes popping like stars. But in that moment Blaze felt centered, grounded. His shoulder still ached from that game-winning catch, and tomorrow there would be new challenges to face at the firehouse and beyond. But right now, with the championship secured and Tessa in his arms, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. A flash went off nearby, and they turned to see Lila lowering Tessa's spare camera, grinning. Sorry, couldn't resist, she said with a wink. Someone had to capture the photographer for once. Blaze laughed, the sound coming easier than it had in months, keeping one arm around Tessa as their friends surrounded them. Tank clapped him on his good shoulder, and Coach gave them both a knowing smile that spoke of acceptance. The stadium lights blazed overhead, turning the field into a stage for their triumph. He'd been so worried about balancing it all, the team, his job, his heart. But standing there, surrounded by the people who'd believed in him even when he doubted himself, he realized sometimes the best plays in life, like in football, came down to trust. Trust in himself, in his team, and in the woman who had helped him see that love wasn't a distraction, but a source of strength. Blaze couldn't stop grinning as he entered the Oceanview promenade, now transformed into a victory celebration space. Blue and silver streamers twisted in the ocean breeze, and strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, turning the boardwalk into something magical. The salty air mixed with the scent of grilled food from local vendors who'd set up impromptu stations, serving the growing crowd of supporters. His body still ached from the game, muscles protesting every movement, but the victory high hadn't worn off. The sharp pain in his shoulder from that last diving catch was worth every twinge. Everywhere he looked, people wore Sharks gear, some official, some clearly homemade with hand-painted logos and glitter that sparkled in the evening light. A group of kids ran past, wearing paper shark fins on their backs, and he caught snippets of them reenacting his game-winning catch, complete with exaggerated diving motions and victory dances that made him grin. "There's our hero." Lila's voice carried over the crowd as she approached, carrying 2 bottles of beer, her flip-flops clicking against the boardwalk. She handed him one with a flourish, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Though I have to say, you clean up nice when you're not covered in grass stains and glory. Almost didn't recognize you without the helmet hair." He chuckled, accepting the drink and feeling the cool glass against his palm. He changed into dark jeans, and a navy button-down that Tessa had once mentioned brought out his eyes, though he'd spent 10 minutes debating what to wear like some nervous teenager. "Thanks for putting all this together, Lila. It's incredible. Please, like I could stop this town from celebrating even if I wanted to." She gestured to the crowd with a sweeping motion that nearly spilled her beer. Besides, Quinn helped with the logistics. That woman could organize a hurricane if she put her mind to it. Pretty sure she had spreadsheets for the napkin colors. As if on cue, Quinn appeared with Drew at her side, both of them looking relaxed and happy in a way that made something in Blaze's chest settle. Drew had his arm around Quinn's waist, and Blaze noticed how naturally they fit together now, compared to their early days of constant bickering and tension-filled strategy meetings. "Hell of a game, Rivera," Drew said, extending his free hand, pride evident in his voice. "That catch? Pure poetry in motion. The stuff highlight reels are made of." Blaze shook his hand firmly, remembering all the extra practices, the drills, the moments of doubt. "Couldn't have done it without that perfect pass, coach. You put it right where it needed to be." "And he's modest too," Quinn teased, but her smile was genuine and warm. "The magazine's going to love that about you. I've already got 3 other publications asking about feature stories. Seems everyone wants to know about our small-town hero." "Speaking of publications," Lila interrupted, climbing onto a nearby chair despite several concerned looks from passers-by and Blaze's firefighter instincts screaming about safety hazards. She clinked a spoon against her bottle until the crowd quieted. "If I could have everyone's attention. Though let's be honest, I usually do anyway." The gathering crowd laughed, and Blaze felt a familiar warmth at his side as Tessa slipped her hand into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. She'd been taking photos of the celebration, documenting everything with her artistic eye, but her camera hung forgotten at her side now as she leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his body. "We're here tonight to celebrate not just a victory," Lila continued, wobbling slightly on her perch, "but a team that embodies everything great about our little slice of paradise. They're not just athletes, they're our firefighters, our teachers, our neighbors. And tonight, they're our champions." She raised her bottle, the lights reflecting off the glass. "To the Sharks, who prove that sometimes the biggest dreams come true in small towns. And to Blaze and Tessa, who taught us that love is worth fighting for, even when your dad is a scary-as-hell coach." "Lila." Tessa protested, but she was laughing, her cheeks flushed pink, and even Coach Charlie, standing near the back of the crowd with his arms crossed, cracked a smile that made his mustache twitch. The crowd cheered, and music started playing from the speakers set up along the boardwalk. Blaze recognized the song, a slow, romantic tune that often played at Seaside Sips Cafe during their secret meetings, when they'd steal glances over coffee cups and pretend they weren't falling in love. "Dance with me?" he asked Tessa, pulling her gently toward the space that had cleared in the center of the celebration, the wooden boards of the boardwalk smooth beneath their feet. She pretended to consider it, tilting her head in that way that always made his heart skip. "I don't know. What if someone sees us?" "Let them see," he said, drawing her close as other couples joined them on the makeshift dance floor, the ocean breeze carrying the salt air around them. "I'm done hiding how I feel about you." They swayed together, and Blaze marveled at how right it felt, how perfectly they moved in sync. He'd spent so long compartmentalizing his life, football, firefighting, relationships, afraid that letting one aspect bleed into another would make everything fall apart. But here he was, stronger for having let those walls down, holding the woman he loved while surrounded by the family he'd chosen, in a town that had given him everything he never knew he needed. "What are you thinking about?" Tessa asked, her head resting against his chest. "How wrong I was," he admitted. "About having to choose between the things I love. Between the team and you." She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes soft in the twinkling lights. "We both had some growing to do. Dad too." The celebration continued around them, but as the night wore on, Blaze felt the pull of somewhere quieter. The constant chatter and laughter, though joyful, pressed against his need for peace, a habit born from years of finding solitude after intense rescue calls. When Tessa suggested a walk on the beach, he didn't hesitate. They slipped away from the crowd, making their way down to the shoreline. Tessa had kicked off her shoes, carrying them as they walked hand in hand along the water's edge. The moon cast a silver path across the waves, and the music from the celebration drifted down faintly, creating a perfect soundtrack to their moment. He could feel the gentle squeeze of her fingers intertwined with his, grounding him in ways he never thought possible before her. "I got another email from the magazine today," Tessa said, swinging their joined hands slightly. "They want to do a follow-up piece in 6 months. See how the team's success has impacted the town." "Yeah." Blaze smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from the uncertain photographer who'd been afraid to submit her work. Pride swelled in his chest, remembering how she'd nervously shown him her portfolio late one night at the station. "Sounds like you're building quite a career." "It's scary sometimes," she admitted. "Having these opportunities, knowing they could take me away from here temporarily." She stopped walking, turning to face him. The moonlight caught the amber flecks in her eyes, reminding him of flames dancing in the darkness. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Because I know what I'm coming back to." Blaze pulled her closer, understanding completely. His hands settled naturally at her waist, the position as familiar now as holding a fire hose or catching a pass. "We'll make it work. Your dad was right about one thing: you've got big dreams. And I want to support them, just like you've supported mine." "Speaking of dreams," she said, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, right over the spot where his department badge usually sat, "have you given any thought to Coach Drew's offer? About being assistant coach for the youth league?" He had. The idea of mentoring young players, sharing not just football skills but life lessons about balance and perseverance, appealed to him more than he'd expected. It felt like a natural evolution, another way to serve the community that had given him so much. "I think I might do it. Between that and the firehouse, I'd still have time to help you with your photography projects." "My very own firefighter model," she teased, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Lucky me." The waves lapped at their feet, and a cool breeze carried the salt spray around them. Blaze thought about all the moments that had led them here. The stolen glances at practice, the secret meetings at seaside sips, the way she'd believed in him even when he doubted himself during his recovery. He thought about how fighting their connection had only made it stronger, how letting her in had made him better at everything else in his life. "You know," he said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin, "I used to think being a hero meant never showing weakness, never letting anyone see your struggles. But you taught me something different." "Oh." She raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" "That real strength comes from being vulnerable. From letting people in, even when it's scary. From fighting for what matters, even when it seems impossible." He pulled her closer, feeling her warmth against the cool night air, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with sea salt. "You make me brave, Tessa Caldwell." She smiled up at him, and in her eyes he saw everything he'd ever wanted reflected back. The same look she'd given him after his first game back from injury, when she'd waited for him in the tunnel with her camera and unshakable faith. "And you, Jason Rivera, make me feel like I can conquer the world." They walked further down the beach, talking about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. The celebration continued in the distance, but here, with just the moon and the waves as witnesses, they had found their own perfect moment of victory. Chapter 10: A New Beginning. Tessa sat at her favorite corner table in Seaside Sips, spread her photos across the weathered wood, and tried to focus on selecting the final images for her magazine feature. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the glossy prints just right. Her heart swelled with pride at how far she'd come, from sneaking shots at football practice to landing her first major publication. "These are incredible," Sarah, the barista, said as she set down Tessa's usual vanilla latte. She pointed to a particularly striking image of Blaze mid-catch, his body stretched horizontal against the setting sun. That one's my favorite. Mine too, Tessa admitted, running her finger along the edge of the photo. She'd captured the exact moment when determination met grace, when all of Blaze's strength and vulnerability merged into something beautiful. The magazine editor had specifically requested this shot for the opening spread. Her phone buzzed with a text from her dad, "Team meeting tomorrow. Bring your camera. Big plans to discuss." The old Tessa might have bristled at the assumption she'd be there, but now she smiled. Their relationship had shifted since the championship game, settling into something more equal, more understanding. He'd even started asking her opinion on team promotional materials, acknowledging that her eye for capturing the Sharks' spirit could help build their future. "Hey stranger," Lila's voice cut through her thoughts as she dropped into the chair opposite. "Still obsessing over which version of my future brother-in-law to immortalize?" Tessa felt her cheeks warm. "We're not? I mean, he hasn't." "Please," Lila rolled her eyes, stealing a sip of Tessa's latte. "The way that man looks at you. Trust me, it's only a matter of time." She picked up one of the photos, this one showing Blaze working with some of the younger players during a community practice. "Speaking of future plans, I've been thinking about expanding the surf shop." "Yeah." Tessa gathered the remaining photos, carefully sliding them into her portfolio. Maybe adding a coffee bar, some workspace areas. Make it more of a hangout spot." Lila's eyes sparkled with that familiar Carson determination. "Plus, I met someone who might be interested in partnering up." "Business partner or?" Tessa raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Lila winked. "But enough about me. How's it feel being Oceanview's rising star photographer?" Before Tessa could answer, her phone lit up with another text, this time from Blaze. "Meet me at the beach? Sunset?" Her heart did that familiar flutter it always did when she saw his name. "Actually, I need to pack these up. I'm meeting Blaze." "Say no more," Lila stood, grinning. "Just remember, I expect to be your first client when you're famous and charging obscene amounts for photo shoots." Tessa laughed, gathering her things. The walk to their usual spot on the beach took longer than necessary, because she kept stopping to capture the way the late afternoon light painted everything in gold. When she finally rounded the corner past the old pier, she saw Blaze waiting, something large tucked under his arm. "I was starting to think you got lost," he teased, but his eyes were soft as they always were when he looked at her. "Just practicing." She held up her camera. "What's that?" Instead of answering, he pulled her close with his free arm, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Close your eyes." She did, hearing the rustle of paper being removed. "Okay," his voice was quiet, almost nervous. "Look." When she opened her eyes, she gasped. There in a simple driftwood frame was her favorite shot from the championship game, not of Blaze's winning play, but of the moment after. She'd captured him looking up at the stands, joy and relief and love so clear on his face that it made her throat tight even now. "Blaze," she touched the frame gently. "I thought maybe it could go in your studio," he said, watching her face. "When you open it, I mean." "Because you will. Open your own studio." Tears pricked at her eyes. "You really think so?" "I know so." He set the frame carefully in the sand, and pulled her into his arms properly. "You've taught me a lot about believing in myself, Tess. About not letting fear hold you back. It's time you took your own advice." She leaned into him, breathing in the familiar mix of salt air and his cologne. "Speaking of not holding back, Dad mentioned there's a team meeting tomorrow?" "Yeah," Blaze's chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "He wants me to take on more of a leadership role. Help recruit some new talent, maybe start a youth program." "That's amazing." She pulled back to look at him. "You'd be perfect for that." "We'll see," but he was smiling, that confident smile she'd fallen in love with. "One step at a time, right?" The sun was starting its final descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Tessa reached for her camera instinctively, but Blaze caught her hand. "Maybe just this once," he said softly. You could just watch the sunset with me? No lens between us. She let him pull her down to sit in the sand, the framed photo propped beside them, her camera forgotten in her lap. As the colors deepened and the first stars began to appear, Tessa thought about how far they'd both come. From stolen glances at practice to this, building something real, something lasting, something entirely their own. What are you thinking about? Blaze asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Just that sometimes the best shots are the ones you don't capture, she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. The ones you just live instead. He laughed softly, pressing a kiss to her hair. Now you're starting to sound like a real photographer. Starting to? She poked his ribs, making him squirm. Okay. He caught her hand again, bringing it to his lips. You've always been amazing. I just had to catch up to what everyone else already knew. Tessa fidgeted with the small package in her hands, wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with twine. She debated for weeks about the right moment to give it to Blaze, and somehow tonight felt perfect. The community bonfire was in full swing around them, casting warm light across the beach, where the whole town had gathered to celebrate the start of summer. Hey, she said, catching Blaze's attention as he finished helping some kids roast marshmallows. Got a minute? His eyes lit up the way they always did when he looked at her, and Tessa's heart did that familiar flip. He dusted his hands off on his jeans and followed her to a quieter spot near the water's edge. What's up? He asked, then noticed the package. Tess, you didn't have to. I wanted to, she cut him off, thrusting the package toward him. It's not much, just something I've been working on. Blaze carefully unwrapped the package, and Tessa held her breath as he revealed the leather-bound photo album inside. He opened it slowly, and she watched his expression shift as he took in the first image, himself in full firefighter gear, silhouetted against flames during that big rescue last month. These are from, his voice trailed off as he turned the pages. From every call I've been able to photograph, she explained, moving closer to point out details. See? I included the stories too, from the local paper. The kids you saved from that apartment fire, the elderly couple's cat you rescued from a tree, which, by the way, was adorably cliché. He laughed softly, but she could see the emotion in his eyes as he studied each page. The final image was her favorite, Blaze kneeling to help a little girl try on his helmet at the station's open house, both of them grinning wide. Tess, this is, he shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. You're always so focused on what you could do better, what you might have missed, she said softly. I wanted you to see what I see. What the whole town sees. Before he could respond, a cheer went up from the main bonfire. They turned to see Drew lighting the second fire pit, Quinn beside him shaking her head with obvious affection. The flames caught quickly, sending sparks dancing into the darkening sky. Remember when we thought keeping secrets was the hardest part? Tessa mused, watching the townspeople gather around both fires, sharing drinks and stories. She spotted her dad deep in conversation with some of the newer Sharks players, gesturing animatedly about what was probably a new play strategy. Turns out being honest was scarier, Blaze agreed, his arm sliding around her waist. He was still holding the album carefully in his other hand, like something precious. The music changed to something slow and acoustic, and couples began swaying together in the firelight. Tessa recognized the song. It was the same one that had been playing during their first real conversation at Seaside Sips, though she doubted Blaze remembered that detail. But then he surprised her, setting the album safely on a nearby bench and pulling her into a slow dance. This was playing that day you finally let me buy you coffee, he murmured near her ear. You remember that? I remember everything about falling in love with you, he said simply, and Tessa had to blink back sudden tears. Across the fire she caught Drew giving them a thumbs up while Quinn elbowed him in the ribs, both of them wearing knowing smiles. It struck Tessa then how many people had been in their corner all along, even when she and Blaze had been too scared to admit what was growing between them. We really did it, didn't we? She said, looking up at him. Made it through all the drama, the secrets, Dad's disapproval. Your terrible coffee order, he teased, earning himself a light smack on the chest. My coffee order is perfectly reasonable. Tess, no one needs that many pumps of vanilla syrup. It's basically dessert at that point. She laughed, resting her head against his chest as they continued to sway. You know what, though? I wouldn't change any of it. Even the hard parts. No. His hand traced gentle patterns on her lower back. No, she said firmly. Because we figured it out together. That's what we do now, right? Face things together? Blaze pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, his expression serious now. Together, he agreed. Whatever comes next, good or bad, easy or hard, we handle it as a team. Is that a promise, Rivera? That's a guarantee, Caldwell. He sealed it with a kiss that made her toes curl in the sand, ignoring the wolf whistles from what sounded suspiciously like Lila's direction. The music shifted again, something upbeat that had kids running to dance, breaking their moment. But Tessa didn't mind. She liked these reminders that they were part of something bigger, this wonderful, messy, loving community that had helped shape their story. Walk with me? Blaze asked, retrieving the photo album and taking her hand. They slipped away from the crowd, following the shoreline where gentle waves lapped at the sand. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant streaks of pink and orange, the kind of scene Tessa would normally be scrambling to photograph. But tonight she was content to simply experience it, her hand warm in Blaze's as they walked in comfortable silence. The sound of laughter and music from the bonfire grew fainter behind them, but its warmth seemed to follow them, wrapped around them like a promise of all the good things still to come. Tessa squeezed Blaze's hand and he squeezed back, their own private Morse code for I love you that they developed during those early days of stolen moments and secret smiles.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like, and comment. I love hearing from you. You can also visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date.